Hey everyone, welcome to Yellowfan. Today I want to argue that The Simpsons did not just decline, it died. Not the show itself. The show is still running. It will probably still be running when most of us are old. Fox has renewed it, the episodes keep coming, and Springfield is still on your screen anytime you want it to be. But something inside it died. Something specific and irreplaceable that existed during a window of 6 seasons between 1991 and 1997, built by a group of people who happened to be in the same room at the same time, and then left when those people left and never came back. And today we are going to find out exactly what that thing was, exactly when it died, and exactly why nothing that has come in the 30 years since has ever been able to bring it back. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free, and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough. Let's begin. Where it all began, the birth of Springfield. To understand how something falls, you have to first understand how it was built. And the story of how The Simpsons was built is one of the most strange and beautiful accidents in the history of television. So let us go back to the beginning. It is 1987. Matt Groening is sitting outside a meeting room at Fox Studios. He has been called in to pitch an idea for a series of animated shorts to producer James L. Brooks. Groening had originally planned to pitch an animated version of his comic strip Life in Hell. But sitting outside that room, waiting to go in, he had a sudden change of mind. He was worried that pitching Life in Hell would cost him the rights to his own work. So right there, in the hallway, in the minutes before he walked into that meeting, he sketched out an entirely new family from scratch. He named the characters after his own family: Homer after his father, Marge after his mother, Lisa and Maggie after his sisters. The only name he changed was his own. Instead of Matt, he wrote Bart, a word he liked because it was an anagram of brat. He thought Simpson was a funny last name. It sounded a little like the word simpleton. That felt right for the kind of family he had in mind. Brooks liked what Groening had sketched. The shorts were greenlit almost immediately, and from 1987 to 1989, the Simpson family appeared as rough, crudely drawn cartoon segments on The Tracy Ullman Show, a Fox variety program that most people today have completely forgotten. The shorts were fast, weird, and funny, in a way that felt different from anything else on television. They were not polished, the animation was rough, and the characters moved in ways that would later look nothing like the show people know and love. But there was something alive in those early sketches. Something real. In 1989, Fox gave the green light for a full half-hour series. The show premiered on December 17, 1989, with an episode called Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire. In it, Homer discovers that the family has no money for Christmas because Marge spent everything on removing Bart's tattoo. He secretly takes a job as a department store Santa Claus to try to earn money for gifts. When that fails, he takes his son Bart to a dog race and bets everything on a dog called Santa's Little Helper. The dog loses. But as Homer and Bart walk away defeated, Santa's Little Helper runs to them after being abandoned by his owner. Homer brings the dog home. The family's Christmas is not the one they planned, but it is warm and funny and oddly moving. It was not a typical cartoon episode. There were no supervillains, no one saved the world. It was just a struggling father trying to give his family a good Christmas, and failing in almost every way, but succeeding in the only way that mattered. That emotional honesty was something audiences had never seen in animation before. The show was a hit from the very beginning. Within its first season, it was getting around 30 million viewers per episode in the United States. For comparison, there are entire countries today with fewer than 30 million people. But ratings alone do not explain what The Simpsons became. To understand that, you have to understand the man who is quietly responsible for building the machine behind it. His name was Sam Simon. Most people who love The Simpsons have never heard of him. They know Matt Groening's name because he created the characters, and because his name appears in the credits of every single episode to this day. But the man who arguably shaped what the show actually was, the jokes, the tone, the emotional core, the writing team, was Sam Simon. Former Simpsons director Brad Bird once called him the unsung hero of the show. That is a big thing to say. And it is accurate. Simon co-developed The Simpsons alongside Groening and James L. Brooks. He served as the showrunner and creative supervisor for the show's first 4 seasons. Before The Simpsons, he had already been the head writer of Taxi at just 23 years old, and had written for Cheers, 2 of the most beloved sitcoms of their era. He came into The Simpsons writer's room as the most experienced person there, and he ran it like that. His first and most important job was assembling the writing team. The group he put together was remarkable. John Swartzwelder, George Meyer, John Vitti, Al Jean, Mike Reiss, Jay Kogan, Wallace Wolodarski. Each of these writers would go on to be recognized as some of the best comedy writers in television history. Several of them would later create their own legendary shows. David X. Cohen, who joined the room slightly later, would go on to create Futurama with Matt Groening. Greg Daniels, also a Room alum, would go on to create the American version of The Office and King of the Hill. Sam Simon did not just hire good writers. He built a culture. He created some of the show's most important long-running characters. Mr. Burns, the cold, ancient, absurdly powerful owner of the nuclear power plant, was a Sam Simon creation. So was Chief Wiggum, the utterly incompetent Springfield police chief. So was Bleeding Gums Murphy, the jazz musician who forms a deep bond with Lisa in one of the show's earliest emotional episodes. Simon also established the process the show would use to write its scripts. Every episode went through intensive group rewrites, where the entire writing staff sat in a room together and improved every single line. It was not enough for a joke to be funny once. It had to be as funny as it could possibly be. The bar was constantly raised. One of the phrases Simon used in the early writers' room was 13 and out. Fox had ordered 13 episodes of the first season, and Simon would tell the writers that they should write as if those 13 episodes were all they would ever get. Not because he expected failure, but because he wanted them to take risks. He wanted them to make the show they actually wanted to make, rather than the show they thought a network would want. As he explained years later, it was a call to creative freedom. Write something your friends will love, not something you think will keep executives happy. That spirit of creative freedom is all over the first few seasons of The Simpsons. The show was willing to be dark, emotional, satirical, and strange in ways that were genuinely unusual for a cartoon in 1989. But Simon's time at the show was not peaceful. His relationship with Matt Groening became, in Groening's own words, very contentious. The exact reasons for the tension were complex, but the breaking point was money. The Simpsons had become a massive commercial success. Merchandise, syndication deals, and international sales were making enormous sums. Groening was getting rich. Simon felt he was not getting his fair share. According to an account in John Ortvid's oral history of the show, at one point Simon opened an envelope from Fox, looked at what was inside, threw it on the floor in anger, and stormed out of the room. The envelope had contained a check for $34,000. In 1993, after 4 seasons, Sam Simon left The Simpsons. Before he walked out, he negotiated one of the most extraordinary exit deals in television history. He secured a share of every episode of The Simpsons, past and future, plus a percentage of all licensing and syndication revenue, plus a permanent executive producer credit on every episode forever. He told a 60 Minutes interviewer in 2007 that the arrangement paid him well over $10 million a year. He would carry that credit, listed on every single Simpsons episode that ever aired, until his death from colorectal cancer on March 8, 2015. His nickname in the Treehouse of Horror credits was Sam Sayonara Simon. He was gone. But the show he had helped build was only just getting started. The 2 seasons Simon ran, Season 1 and Season 2, are today considered by many fans and critics to be the shakiest of the Golden Age, if they count as Golden Age at all. Vulture described them as wobbly overall compared to what came after. They were still good television. They were still funnier and smarter than almost anything else on the air. But the show had not yet found the full version of itself. The characters were still being defined. Homer could be warmer than he would later become, but also harsher in ways that did not quite fit. The animation was inconsistent. Some jokes landed hard, others fell flat. What the first 2 seasons were, more than anything, was a foundation. They established that Homer was a working-class man who loved his family even when he failed them. They established that Bart was a troublemaker with a good heart underneath. They established that Lisa was the smartest and loneliest member of the family. They established that Marge was the emotional anchor of everything, the person who held the chaos together. And they established that Springfield was not just a backdrop, but a living, breathing community with its own rules, its own rhythms, and its own deeply weird population. That foundation was what Al Jean and Mike Reiss inherited when they took over as showrunners beginning in season 3. Those 2 men had been part of the show since the very beginning, hired by Sam Simon as part of the original writing team. They had written for the Harvard Lampoon together, and both described themselves as feeling enormous pressure not to screw up this thing everyone loves when they took the reins. That anxiety, as one retrospective noted, drove them to rewrite scripts obsessively and push every episode to be the best version of itself. The results of that pressure were Season 3, Season 4, and the seasons that followed. The years that the world would eventually call the Golden Age of The Simpsons. The show that Matt Groening sketched in a hallway in 1987. That Sam Simon turned into something with a real soul. That Al Jean and Mike Reiss pushed into a state of genuine greatness, was about to become the most important television program of its generation. But greatness is never permanent, and the very things that made The Simpsons extraordinary would eventually become the things that made it impossible to sustain. Because when you look back at how this show was built, the impossible writing talent that came together in one room, the creative philosophy that drove every line to be funnier than the last, the irreplaceable voices that made Springfield feel alive, you start to understand that what the Golden Age was built on was not just skill. It was a specific group of specific people in a specific moment doing something they could only do together for so long. And when those people started to leave, some by choice, some by circumstance, some by tragedy, the show they had built could not simply be handed to the next group and stay the same. The question of why it fell apart begins with understanding what it was built on. And what it was built on, more than anything else, was a writing room full of extraordinary talent that was quietly being assembled, quietly being used up, and quietly beginning to scatter. Starting with the man who ran that room in the beginning, and the people he gathered around him, the story of the death of the Golden Age is really a story about what happens when something great depends on people, and those people can only stay for so long. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Which brings us to the next question. Who exactly were those people, and what did they actually do? Section 2. The architect nobody talks about. Sam Simon's hidden fingerprints. There is a name that almost never comes up when people talk about The Simpsons. When fans argue about their favorite episodes, they talk about the writers who penned them. When they talk about the show's legacy, they mention Matt Groening. When they debate the Golden Age, they bring up the showrunners, Al Jean, Mike Reiss, the names attached to the seasons they love. And when they talk about the decline, they point fingers at the people who were in charge when things went wrong. But there is one name that sits behind almost all of it. A name attached to the foundation of everything the Golden Age was built on. A name that appears in the credits of every single Simpsons episode ever made, even though the man behind it stopped working on the show in 1993. That name is Sam Simon. And the story of Sam Simon, who he was, what he built, and why he left, is one of the most important stories in the entire history of The Simpsons. because you cannot fully understand how the Golden Age happened without understanding him. And you cannot fully understand why the show eventually lost what made it special without understanding what walked out the door when he did. Sam Simon was born on June 6, 1955 in Los Angeles. He grew up in Beverly Hills and showed an early talent for comedy writing. By the time he was 23 years old, an age when most people are still figuring out what they want to do with their lives, he was already running the writer's room of Taxi, one of the most critically praised sitcoms on American television at the time. That is a remarkable thing. The writer's room of a major network television show is one of the most competitive and demanding environments in entertainment. Running one at 23 means you were not just talented, you were exceptional. After Taxi, he wrote for and produced Cheers, another show that is still widely considered one of the greatest sitcoms ever made. By the late 1980s, Simon had a television resume that most writers spend their entire careers trying to build. He understood character. He understood structure. He understood how to make a joke land in a way that also made the audience care about the people telling it. When James L. Brooks brought him in to co-develop The Simpsons alongside Matt Groening, Simon was the most experienced person in the room, and he acted like it. His most important contribution, the one that shaped everything that came after, was assembling the writing staff. Sam Simon did not just hire good writers. He found exceptional ones, and he found them in unusual places. Several of the show's most legendary early writers came to Simon's attention through a small, self-published comedy magazine called Army Man. The magazine was created by George Meyer, who had previously written for David Letterman and Saturday Night Live. Army Man had only 3 issues. It never had a wide audience, but in comedy circles, it had a reputation far beyond its size. Its jokes were dense, dark, and written at a level that made other comedy writers stop and take notice. Simon read Army Man and immediately wanted the people behind it. He brought in George Meyer. Through Meyer, he connected with John Swartzwelder and John Vitti, both of whom had also contributed to the magazine and worked alongside Meyer at Saturday Night Live. He also hired Al Jean, Mike Reiss, Jake Hogan, and Wallace Wolodarski, rounding out a writing room that would produce some of the funniest and most emotionally intelligent television ever made. Brad Bird, who directed several episodes of The Simpsons before going on to make The Incredibles and Ratatouille, called Simon the unsung hero of the show. That phrase, unsung hero, captures something real. Simon never became a household name the way Matt Groening did. He did not have his face on merchandise. He did not give the endless interviews and documentaries that Groening did. But the people who actually worked on the show knew what he had built. The culture Simon created in that writer's room was specific and demanding. Every script went through intensive group rewriting sessions where the entire staff sat together and worked on every single line. The credited writer of an episode might have written the original draft, but by the time it reached the screen, it had been shaped, improved, and sharpened by the collective effort of everyone in the room. George Meyer, one of the writers Simon recruited, became legendary for his role in these sessions. A.O. Scott of the New York Times described Meyer as the guru of the room. Writer Mike Reiss once said that when they were in the rewrite sessions, writers would involuntarily glance at Meyer for approval whenever they pitched a line. That kind of creative influence is rare. Meyer was only officially credited as the writer or co-writer of 12 episodes across the show's run, but his fingerprints were on far more than 12 episodes. He was the invisible shaping force in almost every room rewrite during the Golden Age. John Swartzwelder had a different kind of influence. Where Meyer was a constant presence in the room, Swartzwelder was famously a ghost. He would write his drafts from home, first from a diner booth where he would sit for hours drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes, and later from an actual diner booth he purchased and had installed in his own house after California passed laws banning smoking in restaurants. He sent his drafts in and let the rest of the staff revise them. Despite almost never being present for the group sessions, his drafts reportedly required less rewriting than almost anyone else's. They arrived polished, layered, and already very funny. The other writers rarely had to tear them apart the way they tore apart other people's work. Between them, this group established a writing culture that had very specific values. The show was not supposed to be a string of jokes with characters as delivery devices. The characters were supposed to be real people, flawed, recognizable, and worth caring about. The humor was supposed to come from truth. When Homer failed, it was supposed to feel like something. When Lisa was lonely, it was supposed to sting. When Bart pulled a prank and faced consequences, the consequences were supposed to matter. This is the part of The Simpsons' golden age that is hardest to describe to someone who only knows the show from its later years. It was not just funnier than what came after, it was emotionally grounded in a way that later seasons simply were not. The jokes landed harder because the characters behind them were real, and Sam Simon was the person who insisted on that. His philosophy, as producer Ken Levine described it, was that the show should always ask, "What are they thinking?" The characters' emotions had to drive everything. The comedy came from people being people, not from situations being constructed around them. Levine put it plainly. Is it too bizarre to say he made cartoon characters three-dimensional? His comedy is all about character, not just a string of gags. Simon also created characters that became cornerstones of the show. Mr. Burns, the ancient, evil, impossibly wealthy owner of the Springfield nuclear power plant, was Sam Simon's creation. Burns became one of the greatest villains in television comedy history, a character so cartoonishly awful that he made you laugh out loud while also representing something genuinely dark about wealth and power in America. His voice, delivered by Harry Shearer, became instantly recognizable. His lines became some of the most quoted in the show's history. But the seed of that character, the idea of him, the specific flavor of his cruelty and his obliviousness, came from Sam Simon. Chief Wiggum, the completely useless Springfield chief of police, was also Simon's creation. Wiggum became one of the show's most beloved supporting characters, precisely because his incompetence was so complete and so consistent. He was not just bad at his job occasionally, he was bad at it in a way that suggested he had never been good at it, could never be good at it, and had somehow arrived in a position of authority through a process no one could fully explain. That specific kind of institutional failure, someone in charge of something important who is completely unqualified, is one of the sharpest jokes the show ever told, and Simon put it there from the beginning. Bleeding Gums Murphy, the jazz musician who connects with Lisa in the episode Moaning Lisa in Season 1, was another Simon creation. That character's brief appearance established something crucial about who Lisa Simpson was. She was not just a smart kid, she was a lonely one. She needed to be seen and understood by someone who operated on her level. Bleeding Gums Murphy, in just one episode, gave the audience a window into Lisa's inner world that the show would return to for years. Simon built that window. But Sam Simon did not stay. The relationship between Simon and Matt Groening had been difficult almost from the start. Groening later described it as very contentious. The two men had different personalities and different ideas about creative ownership. Simon was a television veteran who had built real things before The Simpsons. Groening had created the characters in the world, but he was less experienced in the actual mechanics of running a television show. That difference in experience created friction. There were creative disagreements. There was tension over credit and recognition. But the final breaking point, by all accounts, was money. The Simpsons had become one of the most commercially successful entertainment properties in the world. Merchandise alone was generating extraordinary sums. Syndication deals were bringing in money at a scale that the show's creators had not anticipated. The profits were enormous, and Sam Simon felt he was not receiving what he deserved from those profits. The story, reported in John Ortved's oral history of the show, captures the moment of breakdown as clearly as any single incident can. Simon received an envelope from Fox. He opened it, looked at the contents, threw them on the floor, and stormed out of the room. The envelope had contained a check for $34,000. Not a small amount of money in any ordinary situation. But for a man who had co-created one of the most financially successful television programs in history, it felt like an insult. In 1993, after 4 seasons, Sam Simon left. He left. But he did not leave empty-handed. Before walking away, he negotiated a deal that is almost impossible to believe. He secured a share of every future episode of The Simpsons. He secured a percentage of all licensing and syndication revenue. And he secured a permanent executive producer credit, meaning his name would appear in the credits of every Simpsons episode that aired for the rest of the show's life, regardless of whether he had anything to do with it. That deal, as he told 60 Minutes in 2007, paid him well over $10 million a year. Every single year. From a show he had not worked on since 1993. His nickname in the Treehouse of Horror episodes became Sam Sayonara Simon. Even the joke the show made about his departure acknowledged that he had left on his own terms. He spent the last decades of his life giving almost all of that money away. He created the Sam Simon Foundation, which rescued dogs from shelters and trained them to serve as assistance animals for people in need. He funded feeding programs and animal welfare organizations. When he was diagnosed with terminal colorectal cancer in late 2012 and told he had 3 to 6 months to live, he announced his intention to donate his entire fortune to charity. He then proceeded to live for 2 more years before dying on March 8, 2015, at the age of 59. Al Jean, the showrunner who had worked with Simon since the very beginning, said simply, "We will miss Sam's phenomenal talents, sharp intelligence, and sly sense of humor." What Simon left behind at The Simpsons when he walked out was a machine, had built, and a culture he had established. The writing team was in place. The characters he had created were embedded in the show. The standard he had set, that the show had to ask what the characters were thinking, that the humor had to come from emotional truth, was part of the DNA of every script. For a while, that culture survived without him. Al Jean and Mike Reiss carried it forward through seasons 3 and 4. The showrunners who followed them, David Merkin, then Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein, understood what the show was supposed to be and kept it alive. The Golden Age continued for years after Simon left, but something was different when he was gone. Something about having the person who built the room actually in the room matters in ways that are difficult to measure. The show kept his characters and kept his values for a while. But without Simon there to enforce that emotional standard, to insist that every joke had to come from a real human place, the drift was always possible. And eventually, the drift came. The writing room Simon assembled would not stay together forever. Writers who had been there since the beginning would leave. New writers would come in who had never worked under Simon, who had learned to write The Simpsons by watching it rather than by living the culture that created it. Characters he had built with specific logic and specific emotional purpose would gradually be stretched and simplified until they no longer quite resembled themselves. Sam Simon built the temple. The Golden Age lived inside it for years, but temples require the people who understand them to keep them standing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The writers who did keep it standing, particularly the extraordinary individuals in that original room, are the real story of why the Golden Age was as good as it was. And none of them were more important, more mysterious, or more influential than the man who wrote more Simpsons episodes than any other writer in the show's history. And almost no one outside the writer's room has ever really talked about him. Section 3. The Golden Age Defined. Seasons 3 through 8. There is a specific feeling that comes with watching a great Simpsons episode from the Golden Age. It is not just that the jokes are funny. Plenty of shows have funny jokes. It is not just that the animation is good, or that the voice acting is great, or that the story is clever. It is something harder to name, a feeling that you are watching something that understands people. That the writers in that room had sat down together and thought carefully about what it means to be a father who loves his family but keeps failing them. What it means to be a little girl who is smarter than everyone around her and lonelier because of it. What it means to be a boy who acts like he does not care about anything because caring feels dangerous. The golden age of The Simpsons, the period that fans and critics most consistently identify as the show at its very best, ran roughly from Season 3 through Season 8, that is 1991 to 1997. 6 seasons, around 130 episodes. And within those 130 episodes, there is more consistently brilliant television than almost any other show has produced across its entire run. But before we go inside those years and look at what made them extraordinary, it is worth understanding exactly what the show became at the start of Season 3, because the shift was significant. Seasons 1 and 2 were the show finding its feet. As we talked about in the last section, those early episodes were good television, funny, occasionally moving, clearly built on something real. But the characters were not yet fully themselves. Homer could feel too harsh in some moments and too soft in others. The jokes were great, but they did not always come from a deep understanding of who these people were. The animation was rougher. The rhythm of the show was still being figured out. Season 3 changed that. Al Jean and Mike Reiss took over as showrunners and something clicked. The show became sharper, more confident, and more willing to be both funnier and sadder at the same time. The characters settled into the versions of themselves that the world fell in love with. Homer became the version of Homer that people quote to this day. Genuinely stupid in specific ways that were also somehow understandable, driven by food and comfort and television, but redeemed constantly by a love for his family that he could never fully articulate. Bart became less of a simple troublemaker and more of a complicated kid, mischievous and fearless on the outside, deeply insecure on the inside. Lisa became fully herself, the conscience of the family, brilliant and isolated, fighting to be taken seriously in a house that often could not see her. And Springfield itself became a fully realized world. Vulture described the first 2 seasons as wobbly overall compared to what came after. That description is accurate and also generous. Seasons 3 through 8 are in a different category entirely. They are not just better versions of what came before, they are a different level of achievement. Let us talk about specific episodes because the Golden Age is best understood through its best work. Season 3 gave audiences Homer at the Bat, an episode in which Mr. Burns assembles a team of professional baseball players to win a company softball game, including names like Roger Clemens, Wade Boggs, Jose Canseco, and Ozzie Smith. What makes the episode great is not the celebrity lineup. It is the jokes built around each player, the absurd fates that sideline them one by one, and the fact that Homer, the ordinary man who started all of this, ends up being the unlikely hero. It was one of the first times the show put together a large group of real celebrity voices and made it work not because of who they were, but because of how they were used. Season 3 also gave audiences Lisa's Substitute, an episode that many people who grew up watching the show cite as one of the most emotionally affecting pieces of television they have ever seen. Lisa gets a substitute teacher named Mr. Bergstrom, voiced by Dustin Hoffman, who is credited only as Sam Edick to maintain some distance from the role. Mr. Bergstrom sees Lisa for exactly who she is, her intelligence, her sensitivity, her loneliness, and treats her accordingly. When he has to leave, Lisa is devastated. She asks him how she is supposed to cope without him. He writes her a note and tells her to read it when she needs it most. The note says, "You are Lisa Simpson." That is it. 4 words. And it is one of the most quietly powerful moments in the show's entire history. Not because of any elaborate plot or dramatic twist, but because of how accurately it captured what it feels like to be seen by someone who understands you, and what it feels like to lose that. That is what the Golden Age did consistently. It found the emotional truth underneath the comedy and let both exist at the same time. Season 4 arrived with Marge vs. the Monorail, written by a young Conan O'Brien who had recently joined the writing staff. The episode is regularly cited as one of the greatest pieces of comedic writing in television history. Springfield receives $3 million in a settlement, and a charming con man named Lyle Lanley, voiced by Phil Hartman, convinces the town to spend it on a poorly built monorail. The episode is an almost perfect parody of the musical The Music Man, complete with a song that is so catchy it was reused in a later season clip show. Variety's description of it says everything. It is a masterclass in pacing, filled with iconic moments from start to finish. Vulture's Adam Frucci once called it the best sitcom episode ever. Season 4 also contained Homer the Heretic, the first episode to feature God as an actual character in the show, distinguished from regular Springfield residents by his larger size and 5 fingers on each hand, while everyone else has 4. Homer decides to skip church and spend Sunday morning at home, where he has the best morning of his life. He falls asleep and meets God. The episode is both genuinely funny and genuinely thoughtful about faith, routine, and what it means to find joy in simple things. It manages to be deeply warm without being preachy. Season 5 contained what many consider the greatest run of consecutive high-quality episodes in the show's history. Cape Fear, the Sideshow Bob episode that parodies the movie Cape Fear, is a masterclass in comedic tension. Bob is released from prison, immediately pledges to kill Bart, and the family enters witness protection as the Van Houten family. The episode builds and builds until it reaches a sequence so perfectly constructed that comedy writers still study it today. Bob, having cornered Bart on a houseboat, is tricked into performing the entire score of the musical HMS Pinafore before he can commit the murder. It is bizarre, brilliant, and hilarious in a way that requires both intelligence and absolute commitment to the bit. Season 5 also contained Deep Space Homer, where Homer is selected by NASA to go into space to boost their ratings. Season 5 gave audiences Homer's Barbershop Quartet, where Homer reveals that he was once part of a famous music group called the B Sharps, who had a brief period of extraordinary fame before breaking up, a loving parody of the rise and fall of the Beatles. And Season 5 delivered Treehouse of Horror 5, widely considered the single greatest Halloween episode the show ever produced, featuring 3 segments, each darker and funnier than the last, including a parody of The Shining where Homer goes mad in a snowbound resort, and Bart and Lisa navigate a school cafeteria serving the students as food. Season 6 brought Homer Badman, an episode about the media creating a false story around Homer being accused of sexual harassment, which anticipated the era of viral outrage and mob judgment with almost eerie accuracy. It also brought Bart Sells His Soul, where Bart sells his soul to Milhouse for $5 and spends the episode realizing that something essential has gone out of his experience of the world. The episode takes the idea of a soul seriously enough to make it genuinely unsettling while still being extremely funny. Season 7 gave audiences King Size Homer and Homer the Smithers and the remarkable Summer of 4 Feet, 2 inches, the season finale where the family visits the Flanders Beach House and Lisa tries to reinvent herself with a new group of friends who do not know who she is. It is one of the last episodes that some critics point to as the true end of the show's most grounded, character-driven period. Bart becomes jealous of Lisa's new popularity and tries to sabotage her, but ultimately the episode ends in a way that is warm rather than mean. Lisa wins, genuinely, and it feels earned. And then Season 8. Season 8 is the season that many fans consider the peak of the peak. It contained You Only Move Twice, where Homer gets a dream job offer in a new town and moves the family to Cypress Creek, completely unaware that his new boss, Hank Scorpio, voiced by Albert Brooks, is a James Bond-style world dominator. The episode is beloved because of how it plays Homer's obliviousness against Scorpio's casual evil. Homer is the happiest and most productive he has ever been while working for a man building a doomsday weapon. When the family has to leave, Scorpio sends Homer a gift. Homer wanted the Denver Broncos for his birthday. Scorpio gives him the Denver Broncos. The episode ends with Homer holding a football team he has no idea what to do with. Season 8 also gave audiences The Mysterious Voyage of Homer, the Guatemalan Insanity Pepper episode, where Homer eats an impossibly hot chili pepper and spends the episode in a hallucinatory vision quest guided by a coyote voiced by Johnny Cash. Season 8 brought Homer versus the 18th Amendment, which gave the world the line, "To alcohol, the cause of and solution to all of life's problems." A line so perfectly written that it has been quoted millions of times in the nearly 30 years since. And Season 8 gave audiences Homer's Enemy, the episode that introduced Frank Grimes, a hard-working, self-serious man who cannot understand why Homer, incompetent, irresponsible, cheerfully oblivious, is respected and loved by everyone around him. Frank Grimes declares himself Homer's enemy. Homer tries to make peace. Frank Grimes, unable to process the world he has found himself in, has a complete breakdown and dies. It is one of the darkest episodes the show ever made, and also one of the funniest. What made all of these episodes work was not any single element. It was the combination of all of them at once. The writing was dense with jokes. Not just one joke per scene, but multiple jokes layered on top of each other, so that rewatching an episode years later, you would still catch things you missed the first time. The characters were consistent and recognizable, while also being capable of genuine surprise. The emotional beats were earned rather than forced. The show was willing to let Homer be embarrassing and flawed and still be lovable. It was willing to let Lisa be right about things and still be lonely. It was willing to let Bart be a troublemaker and still have a heart. Time Magazine's decision to name The Simpsons the greatest television series of the entire 20th century was not made lightly, and it was made specifically about this era. The show that earned that title was not the one that would air in Season 15 or Season 20. It was the show that lived in these 6 seasons, that averaged an IMDb rating of 8.2 across its Golden Age episodes, and that produced not a single episode on any credible ranking of the show's 25 best that came from outside its first 9 seasons. That is an extraordinary record. And the question that every Simpsons fan has asked at some point, usually with some mixture of sadness and frustration, is how something that good became something so much less than what it was. The answer to that question is not simple. It is not about one bad episode or one bad decision. It is about the slow loss of very specific people who had very specific gifts, and what happened to the show each time one of those people left. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The most important of those people, the one who wrote more episodes than anyone else, who shaped the show's comedy more than almost any credited voice, who barely ever appeared in public and gave exactly one interview in his entire career, is the person we need to talk about next. Section 4, The Secret Weapon, John Swartzwelder and the Writers Who Built the Temple. There is a joke that gets made about the Simpsons writers' room during the Golden Age. The joke is that it was basically a Harvard reunion. It is not entirely a joke. Al Jean and Mike Reiss met at Harvard. Conan O'Brien went to Harvard. Jeff Martin went to Harvard. John Vitti went to Harvard. The show itself made fun of this fact repeatedly over the years, with characters occasionally referencing the suspiciously large number of Harvard graduates working in a cartoon about a working-class family in a fictional American town. But the most important writer in the history of The Simpsons did not go to Harvard. He did not go to any particularly famous school. He worked in advertising before television. He got his first writing job by mailing jokes to a late-night show with the words "free jokes inside" written on the outside of the envelope, which is either the most embarrassing thing a comedy writer has ever done or the most brilliantly simple, depending on how you look at it. His name is John Swartzwelder, and he wrote 59 episodes of The Simpsons, more than any other writer in the show's history, by a margin of 21 episodes. He is the most prolific writer the show ever had, and also, almost certainly, the least known outside of the people who worked alongside him. He gave exactly one interview in his entire career. He did not attend the group rewriting sessions that every other writer was expected to show up for. He barely existed in public at all. And yet, the writers who worked with him, the showrunners who ran the room alongside him, and the fans who eventually tracked down his work all say more or less the same thing. He was, simply, the funniest writer on the show. Possibly the funniest television comedy writer of his generation. Understanding who he was and what he did, and why his eventual departure from the show matters so much, is one of the most important keys to understanding the Golden Age. John Swartzwelder came to The Simpsons through a small comedy magazine called Army Man. Army Man was created by George Meyer, another writer who would become foundational to the show's golden age. Meyer had previously written for David Letterman and Saturday Night Live, and he put together Army Man as a personal project, a tiny publication that he wrote and distributed in very small numbers to people in comedy circles. It only ever had 3 issues. But those 3 issues had a reputation that was completely out of proportion to how many people had actually read them. In comedy writing circles, Army Man was spoken about the way people speak about a rare piece of music that almost nobody has heard, but everyone who has heard it cannot stop thinking about. Swartzwelder was one of the contributors to Army Man. So was John Vitti. The 3 of them, Meyer, Swartzwelder, and Vitti, had all also crossed paths at Saturday Night Live during the 1985 to 1986 season, a notoriously difficult year for the show that is remembered more for how bad it was than for anything that aired during it. Sam Simon, who was assembling the Simpsons writing team and was a fan of Army Man, recruited all 3. They arrived in the writer's room as part of the original group that would define what the show was. From the beginning, Swartzwelder operated differently from everyone else. Most writers on a television show like The Simpsons are expected to be in the room. They pitch ideas, they attend the group rewriting sessions, they contribute lines on the spot, they argue about jokes, they stay late. The writer's room is a communal experience, and being present is part of the job. Swartzwelder did not do this. He wrote his scripts alone. He wrote them from a booth at his favorite diner, where he would sit for long hours drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes, working through his drafts at his own pace. When California passed a law banning smoking in restaurants, Swartzwelder's solution was not to quit smoking or find a different way to work. He bought a diner booth and had it installed in his own home. He continued to write in his booth, in his house, alone, with his cigarettes, exactly as he had before. He was given special permission to skip the group rewriting sessions and simply send his drafts in for the other writers to revise. This was an extraordinary arrangement. Almost no one else on the show had it. But the reason the showrunners allowed it was simple. His drafts required less rewriting than almost anyone else's. They arrived already very close to finished. Other writers' scripts could be torn apart and rebuilt from scratch during the rewriting process. Swartzwelder's arrived dense and layered, and already funny. And the room's job was mostly to make good work even better, rather than to rescue something that was not working. His colleague Mike Reiss described him in the book Springfield Confidential as a friendly man who will chat endlessly about guy stuff like baseball and old westerns. But Reese also noted that Swartzwelder had a habit of stating things with complete confidence that were either completely untrue or completely insane. Rice gives the example of Swartzwelder once declaring that Abraham Lincoln was an asshole, and that Lorne Greene, the actor who starred in the television western Bonanza, had invented rap music. He stated these things not as jokes, but as facts. Jennifer Crittenden, another Simpsons writer who later went to work on Seinfeld, used to pitch things Swartzwelder had said in real conversation as potential lines for the character Kramer. The Seinfeld writers told her they were too crazy. This gives you a sense of the specific way Swartzwelder's mind worked. He thought in a register that was slightly to the left of normal reality. Not completely disconnected from it, but operating according to its own internal logic that produced jokes no one else would have thought of. The episodes Swartzwelder wrote are some of the most celebrated in the show's entire history. Homer's Enemy, Season 8, Episode 23, is the episode that introduced Frank Grimes, the hard-working man who cannot understand why Homer is loved and respected despite being completely incompetent. It is one of the darkest and most philosophically interesting episodes the show ever made. The episode does not let Homer off the hook the way most episodes do. Frank Grimes is right about Homer. Homer is what's wrong with America, in the specific way Grimes describes. And the fact that everyone loves Homer anyway, and that Grimes is destroyed by his inability to accept this, is both very funny and genuinely disturbing. Rosebud, Season 5, Episode 4. Reimagine the famous movie Citizen Kane as a story about Mr. Burns desperately searching for his childhood teddy bear, which ends up in Maggie's possession. The episode managed to humanize Mr. Burns, a character defined entirely by his complete lack of humanity, by exposing the lonely child that existed somewhere deep inside the monster. It is a remarkable piece of work for a 22-minute cartoon episode. Bart the General was one of Swartzwelder's earliest contributions, a Season 1 episode where Bart organizes the children of Springfield to go to war against the school bully Nelson. The episode established Swartzwelder's love for military parody and absurd escalation, two elements that would appear in his work throughout his time on the show. He also wrote or co-wrote a significant portion of the Itchy and Scratchy episodes, the violent cartoon within a cartoon that Bart and Lisa watch on television. These were often used as a way to comment on television violence and audience expectations, and Swartzwelder's versions were consistently the most extreme and the funniest. His style had a name among people who knew his work. They called it Swartzweldian. The word described a specific kind of joke, dense, fast, built on unexpected twists, written with a very short distance between the setup and the punchline, but somehow never feeling rushed. His jokes did not waste words. Every line was doing something, and the things they did were often strange in ways that felt completely earned rather than random. Al Jean and Mike Reese described him as a huge fan of old American things, old movies, old westerns, old comedy writers from the early part of the 20th century. Names like Robert Benchley and S.J. Perlman, comedy writers from a different era, were his inspirations. This love for old-timey American things, as his colleagues described it, showed up in his episodes in the form of wandering hobos, old-fashioned con men, references to Prohibition-era speakeasies, and a general sense that America had once been a stranger and funnier place than it currently was. But Swartzwelder was not the only extraordinary talent in that room. George Meyer, the man who created Army Man, who Simon recruited to help build the show, had a different kind of influence. Where Swartzwelder worked alone and sent his drafts in from his home booth, Meyer was present in the room and served as the invisible shaping force of almost every episode during the Golden Age. A.O. Scott described him as the guru of the writer's room. Mike Reese said writers would look at Meyer involuntarily when they pitched a line, checking for his approval the way students check a teacher's face when they are not sure if their answer is right. Meyer was officially credited as the writer or co-writer of only 12 episodes, but that number is deeply misleading. He was in the rewriting sessions for almost everything during his time on the show, and according to longtime writer John Vitti, Meyer usually invented the best lines in a given episode, even though other writers may receive script credits. He wrote episodes including Homer the Heretic and Bart's Inner Child, and has been publicly credited with thoroughly shaping the comedic sensibility of the entire show. His contribution to the Golden Age, measured purely by impact, was as significant as anyone who had a higher episode count. Then there was Conan O'Brien, who would later become one of the most famous television hosts in America, but who, during his time on The Simpsons in the early 1990s, was simply a young comedy writer trying to make the room laugh. O'Brien is credited with only 4 episodes as a writer, but his influence in the room was considered significant by the people who worked alongside him. His most famous contribution is Marge versus the Monorail in Season 4, the episode that many people consider the single greatest Simpsons episode ever made. He also wrote New Kid on the Block and Homer Goes to College. He left the show in 1993 to host Late Night, a decision that the Simpsons writing room apparently found both exciting and devastating. John Vitti contributed some of the show's most beloved episodes, Mr. Plow, Lisa's Substitute, and Cape Fear among them. Time magazine and the BBC both listed Cape Fear among the 10 best episodes the show ever produced. Vitti wrote for the show from its very first season through season 16, representing one of the longest tenures of any original writer. What all of these writers had in common, Swartzwelder, Meyer, O'Brien, Vitti, and the others who passed through the room during the Golden Age, was a shared commitment to a specific standard. The jokes had to come from the characters. The characters had to feel real. The humor had to be layered enough that it rewarded people who watched closely, but accessible enough that it could still make someone laugh who was only half paying attention. That standard produced the Golden Age. And it produced it specifically because these writers were all in the room together, pushing each other, competing to make each other laugh, raising the bar on every single script that came through. The problem with building something on that kind of talent is that talent is not transferable. When John Swartzwelder left the show after the 2003 to 2004 season, he did not leave behind a manual explaining how to write like him. When George Meyer stepped back from his active role in the rewriting sessions, there was no one who could simply fill the space he had occupied. When Conan O'Brien left in 1993, the room lost something specific that it never quite recovered. The Golden Age was not just a style of writing, it was a group of people, and groups of people do not stay together forever. Swartzwelder, for his part, has spent the years since leaving The Simpsons writing comedy novels, self-published books featuring a detective character named Frank Burley. He gave his one and only career interview to The New Yorker in 2021, and revealed very little about himself beyond what his colleagues had already described. He remains, appropriately, a mystery. The man who wrote more of the Golden Age than anyone else, who shaped Homer Simpson's comic identity more than almost any credited voice, who built the foundations of the show's greatest era from a diner booth with a cup of coffee and a cigarette. He was, in every sense, the secret weapon. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And when the weapons started leaving, the show they had built began to change in ways that would take years to fully understand. Because the next loss the show suffered was not a writer walking out the door. It was something much more sudden, much more final, and much more publicly devastating. Section 5. Phil Hartman, the man who made Springfield feel alive. There is a specific kind of performer that every great ensemble needs. Not the star, not the lead, not the person whose name goes first in the credits or whose face is on the poster, but the person who makes everything around them better just by being there. The person who can take a line that is merely good and make it great. The person whose presence in a scene gives every other performer something to push against, something to react to, something to build from. In the world of live-action television, these people are called utility players. They're the ones who can play any role, fit into any scene, and consistently deliver without ever needing the spotlight to be pointed directly at them. They are the backbone of every great ensemble, and when they are gone, the absence is felt in ways that are difficult to explain because the loss is invisible. The star is still there, the writing is still happening, the show is still airing, but something is different. Something that held everything together is no longer holding it. For The Simpsons during its golden age, that person was Phil Hartman. Philip Edward Hartman was born on September 24, 1948, in Brantford, Ontario, Canada. He grew up in Connecticut after his family moved to the United States and spent years working in graphic design before finding his way into comedy. He performed with the legendary Los Angeles comedy group The Groundlings, where he developed the ability to inhabit an extraordinary range of characters, voices, walks, attitudes, mannerisms, with a precision that made other performers take notice. In 1986, he joined the cast of Saturday Night Live, where he would spend 8 seasons. His colleagues there gave him a nickname, The Glue. He was called The Glue because he held the show together. In an ensemble built around big personalities and performers who wanted to stand out, Hartman was the one who could disappear into whatever the sketch needed him to be. He could play the straight man or the buffoon. He could do impressions of public figures so accurate they became the defining versions of those people in the public mind. He could anchor a chaotic sketch and give the other performers something solid to work against. He won a Primetime Emmy Award for his work at SNL in 1989. When he left Saturday Night Live in 1994, he joined the cast of the sitcom News Radio, where he played a pompous and self-important news anchor named Bill McNeil. The role was beloved. His castmates on News Radio described him as warm, professional, and endlessly generous with his time and energy. Between seasons of News Radio, he continued doing voice work on The Simpsons, work he described repeatedly as something he did purely for the love of it. He once said, "It is the one thing that I do in my life that is almost an avocation. I do it for the pure love of it," he added. "My favorite fans are Troy McClure fans." Hartman made his first appearance on The Simpsons in Season 2 in the episode Bart Gets Hit by a Car, as a character named Lionel Hutz. The role was originally planned as a one-time appearance, but Hartman enjoyed the work. The staff enjoyed working with him, and they kept writing parts for him. Over the course of 9 seasons, he appeared in 52 episodes, voicing 18 different characters. 52 episodes, 18 characters. Those numbers tell you something about how central he was to the fabric of what the show was during the Golden Age. His 2 most famous recurring characters were Lionel Hutz and Troy McClure. These 2 characters are so embedded in the Golden Age of The Simpsons that it is almost impossible to imagine those years without them. Lionel Hutz was Springfield's most incompetent lawyer. He operated out of a shopping mall booth. He handed out business cards at accident scenes. He once tried to change his name to Miguel Sanchez to avoid the consequences of losing a case. He was a man who had perhaps passed the bar exam at some point in his life, but had clearly not allowed that achievement to burden him with any sense of professional responsibility since. His incompetence was total, consistent, and endlessly inventive. Every time he appeared, the show found a new way to make his failure both bigger and funnier than the last time. And through all of it, Hartman played him with a completely straight face. A man who genuinely believed he was good at his job, which made him infinitely funnier than he would have been if he had any self-awareness at all. Troy McClure was something different. Where Hutz was purely comic, McClure had a strange kind of melancholy underneath the comedy. He was a washed-up Hollywood actor whose career had peaked in the 1970s and had since declined into a steady stream of industrial films, infomercials, and public service announcements. He introduced himself in every appearance with the same formula. "Hi, I'm Troy McClure. You may remember me from such films as..." And then a list of absurd imaginary movie titles. "The President's Neck is Missing," "They Came to Burgle Carnegie Hall," "The Revenge of Abe Lincoln." Each title was a joke on its own, and the fact that McClure delivered them with complete pride and zero irony made them funnier every time. But Troy McClure was also, in a strange way, a genuinely sad character. His career was over. The world had moved on without him. He was doing everything he could to stay relevant, hosting infomercials, appearing in educational videos about safely using power tools, marrying a woman he did not love because his agent told him it would help his public image. He was a man clinging to the edges of a world that had already decided it did not need him. And Hartman played all of that with such precision. The forced cheerfulness, the practiced charm, the slight desperation underneath, that the character worked on multiple levels simultaneously. Chris Turner, in his book Planet Simpson, wrote that McClure and Lionel Hutz together represent the most significant contribution to the show outside of its permanent cast. That is a remarkable claim given how many extraordinary performers and characters the show had during the Golden Age. But it is difficult to argue with. Those two characters alone account for some of the Golden Age's most memorable moments, and they were both entirely the product of one man's voice and one man's talent. Hartman's most celebrated episode as McClure is A Fish Called Selma from Season 7. The episode revolves around Troy's attempt to revive his career by entering into a fake romantic relationship with Marge's sister Selma. His agent convinces him that being seen with a woman will quiet the rumors about his personal life, specifically the rumor that he had an unusual attraction to fish, which had destroyed his career in the first place. Selma agrees to the arrangement, knowing it is not real, but finds herself developing genuine feelings for him. The episode builds to a sequence in which Troy stars in a musical stage adaptation of Planet of the Apes, performing a song called Dr. Zaius. That is so perfectly written and performed that Matt Groening said, "It made me laugh till I cried the first time I saw it." Entertainment Weekly placed A Fish Called Selma 8th on their list of the 25 best Simpsons episodes ever made. IGN named it the best episode of Season 7. The episode is frequently cited as one of the clearest examples of the Golden Age doing something that the later show almost never managed, taking a joke character and finding genuine humanity in them without losing the comedy. Hartman's most celebrated performance as Lionel Hutz arguably comes in Marge in Chains from Season 4, where Hutz defends Marge against shoplifting charges and somehow manages to make everything worse at every possible opportunity. His cross-examination of a witness, in which he produces a bottle of bourbon and informs the jury that it is the evidence, and his immediate call to badger the witness, despite there being no witness to badger, remains one of the most perfectly timed comic sequences in the show's history. But beyond these two characters, Hartman contributed to the show in ways that are less often discussed. He voiced Lyle Lanley, the monorail con man in Marge vs. the Monorail, a role so central to what makes that episode work that it is hard to imagine the episode succeeding with a different performer. Lanley was based on Harold Hill from the musical The Music Man, and Hartman played the character's smooth, fast-talking, completely shameless charm with an ease that made the audience fall for him almost as completely as the citizens of Springfield did. Even knowing the whole time that Lanley was a fraud, you found yourself charmed by him. That is extraordinarily difficult to pull off. He also voiced God in Homer the Heretic. He voiced Moses in a Treehouse of Horror segment. He voiced Nelson's father in a Season 4 episode. He played Plato. He played a cable installer. He played a mobster. In each case, regardless of how small the role or how brief the appearance, Hartman arrived completely prepared and delivered exactly what the scene needed. Matt Groening said he took Hartman for granted because he nailed the joke every time, and that his voice acting produced the maximum amount of humor with any given line. That phrase, the maximum amount of humor, is the most accurate description of what Hartman brought. He did not just deliver the joke, he found every possible laugh inside the joke and delivered all of them simultaneously. Then came May 28, 1998. Phil Hartman was 49 years old. He had been married to his third wife, Bryn Omdahl, since 1987. They had 2 children together. The marriage had been troubled for years, damaged by Bryn's struggles with alcohol and drug use. On the night of May 27, 1998, the couple had an argument. Hartman went to bed. In the early hours of May 28th, Bryn Omdahl took a handgun and shot Phil Hartman 3 times while he slept. He died instantly. She then drove to the home of a friend, confessed to the murder, and returned home. When police arrived, she locked herself in a bedroom and took her own life. Phil Hartman was gone at 49 years old. The cast and crew of The Simpsons were devastated. On the day of his death, rehearsals were canceled. The season 10 episode Bart the Mother, which had already been recorded with Hartman voicing Troy McClure in a brief nature video segment, became his final appearance on the show. The episode aired on September 27, 1998, 4 months after his murder. It was dedicated to his memory. The production staff made a decision that was both an act of respect and an admission of something important. They would not recast Lionel Hutz or Troy McClure. They would not try to find another performer to step into the roles. They would simply retire the characters. Both Hutz and McClure made their last speaking appearances with Hartman's voice and were quietly removed from the show. The writer at Collider who covered this story put it plainly. It was a display of respect and an admission that what Hartman brought was impossible to replace. Matt Groening later said he had always planned to cast Hartman as the voice of Zap Brannigan, a pompous, self-important military commander, when Futurama began production. After Hartman's death, the role went to Billy West. The character's first name, Philip, is widely understood as a tribute to Hartman, though Groening has also said the name came from his own father, Homer Philip Groening. The show's golden age, it is worth noting, was already in the process of ending when Hartman died. Season 9 had already aired. The Principal and the Pauper had already happened. The cracks were already visible to people who were looking closely. But Hartman's death removed something from Springfield that could not be rebuilt or replaced. The specific gravity that his characters provided, the way Hutz and McClure functioned as connective tissue across dozens of episodes, appearing in scenes both major and minor, always reliable, always exactly right, was simply gone. Springfield felt smaller after May 28, 1998. Not in a way that made headlines or that could be pointed to in a ratings chart, but in the way that any world feels smaller when one of the people who made it feel alive is no longer there. The man who could get the maximum amount of humor out of any line he was given was gone, and the show that had relied on him, perhaps without ever fully realizing how much it relied on him, would never sound quite the same again. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. His death was one of the most visible losses the Golden Age suffered, but it was not the only one. And it was not even the most damaging one in terms of what it did to the show's identity. Because before Hartman died, the show had already done something to itself. Something that no outside force caused. Something that came entirely from within. Something that the show's own creator called a mistake years after it happened. And that mistake had a title. Season 9, Episode 2, The Principal and the Pauper. Section 6, the episode that broke everything. The Principal and the Pauper. Every long-running show has a moment, a specific episode, a specific scene, a specific decision that fans point to years later and say, that is where it changed. That is the moment the show stopped being what it was and started becoming something else. Sometimes these moments are obvious while they are happening. Sometimes they only become obvious in hindsight, when you can look back at the full picture and see exactly where the road bent in a direction it should not have gone. For The Simpsons, that moment has a name. It has a season number and an episode number. It has a specific air date and a specific writer and a specific plot that fans still argue about more than 25 years after it first aired. Season 9, Episode 2, The Principal and the Pauper. September 28th, 1997. This is the episode that Matt Groening, the man who created The Simpsons, the man whose name appears in the opening credits of every single episode, the man who has spent decades defending his show against critics, called a mistake. Not in a private conversation, not off the record. In a published interview with Rolling Stone magazine, and again in the Season 9 DVD commentary, Groening looked back at this episode and said it was one of his least favorite things the show had ever done. When the person who created the show calls one of its episodes a mistake, that is significant. When almost everyone who watched it agrees with him, that is historic. To understand why this episode matters so much, you have to first understand who Principal Skinner was in the years before it aired. Seymour Skinner had been a character on The Simpsons since the very first season. He was the principal of Springfield Elementary School, the building where Bart spent his days causing chaos and Lisa spent her days being ignored. Skinner was uptight, anxious, and almost comically devoted to rules and order. He was terrified of Superintendent Chalmers, his boss, in a way that suggested a man who had spent his entire life being afraid of people above him in any kind of authority. He lived with his overbearing mother Agnes, a fact the show returned to repeatedly as a source of both comedy and genuine pathos. He was a Vietnam veteran who carried the weight of that experience quietly. He was, in spite of all his awkwardness and rigidity, a fundamentally decent person trying to do a difficult job in a chaotic environment. Over 8 seasons, the audience had come to know him, not in the way you know a main character. He was a supporting player, but in the way you know a neighbor you have lived next to for years. You know their rhythms. You know what they would and would not do. You have 8 years of evidence about who they are. The episode Sweet Seymour Skinner's Badass Song from Season 5 is the best example of who the show understood Skinner to be. In that episode, Skinner gets fired from his job as principal after Bart accidentally brings Santa's little helper to school and the dog causes chaos. Without his job, Skinner is lost. He and Bart, enemies by nature, develop an unexpected friendship built on mutual loneliness. When Skinner eventually gets his job back, the friendship has to end because the structure of their relationship requires them to be on opposite sides. It is a quiet, genuinely moving episode that treats Skinner as a full human being rather than a punchline. That is the character. Built across 8 seasons, defined by dozens of appearances, understood by millions of people who watch the show every week, that the Principal and the Pauper decided to throw away. The episode begins with a celebration for Principal Skinner's 20th year at Springfield Elementary. In the middle of this celebration, a stranger arrives in Springfield. His name is Sergeant Seymour Skinner, and he claims to be the real Seymour Skinner, a Vietnam veteran who had believed dead after the war. He says the man everyone knows as Principal Skinner is actually an imposter, a soldier from his unit named Armin Tamzarian, who assumed Skinner's identity after the war because his own life had no direction and he thought Skinner was dead. The townspeople investigate. They discover the stranger is telling the truth. The man they have known for 20 years as Principal Skinner, the man the audience has known for 8 seasons, is not who he said he was. He is Armin Tamzarian, a nobody who borrowed another man's life. The real Seymour Skinner, played by guest star Martin Sheen, tries to reclaim his identity. He moves back to Springfield. He takes his mother Agnes back. He tries to resume the life that was taken from him. And then the episode's central joke lands. The people of Springfield decide they prefer the imposter. The real Skinner is too different from the man they know. He is too military, too stiff, too unfamiliar in the ways that matter. So the town sends the real Seymour Skinner away. They tie him to a train and exile him from Springfield. And at the end of the episode, a judge orders that no one is ever allowed to mention any of this again, under penalty of torture. Everything resets. Armin Tamzarian goes back to being Principal Skinner. Life continues. The audience was not amused. The reaction to the principal and the pauper was immediate, and it was severe. Fans online and in the press used words like betrayal. John Hine, the person who coined the phrase jumping the shark to describe the moment a television show makes a desperate change for the worse, specifically listed this episode as the moment The Simpsons jumped the shark. He wrote that the show had finally spotted a fin with the revelation about Skinner's identity. In a 2001 interview, Harry Shearer, the voice actor who had played Skinner for 8 seasons, said that after reading the script, he told the writers, "That is so wrong. You are taking something that an audience has built 8 years or 9 years of investment in and just tossed it in the trash can for no good reason, for a story we have done before with other characters. It is so arbitrary and gratuitous, and it is disrespectful to the audience." Disrespectful to the audience. That phrase from Harry Shearer, the man who lived inside the character, who understood better than almost anyone what Skinner meant to the show, is the most accurate description of what the episode did. Chris Turner, in his book Planet Simpson, called it the broadcast that marked the abrupt plunge from the show's golden age. He described it as one of the weakest episodes in Simpsons history, and said that while it still sports a couple of virtuoso gags, the damage done by its central premise was too significant to be outweighed by any number of individual good jokes. Ian Jones, writing in The Guardian in 2007, argued that the show became stupid in 1997, pointing directly to this episode as the moment it happened. He wrote that the reveal was cheap, idle storytelling, a description that cuts to the heart of what was wrong with it. Alan Sepinwall and Matt Zoller Seitz, writing in the Star Ledger, cited the episode when discussing the show's decline and noted that the plot twist was so implausible that even the characters were disavowing it by the end of the episode. That last part is important. The show knew what it had done was wrong. The judge ordering that no one ever mention this again was a fourth wall moment. The writers acknowledging through the episode's own ending that the story did not work and trying to paper over it with a joke. But the joke did not fix anything. You cannot acknowledge a mistake and simultaneously pretend it did not happen. And Matt Groening himself, in that Rolling Stone interview, called it what it was: a mistake. His least favorite thing the show had done in that season. An episode he wished had not been made the way it was made. The writer of the episode was Ken Keeler, and the showrunners at the time were Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein, the same pair widely credited with some of the show's greatest work during their run in seasons 7 and 8. In the Season 9 DVD commentary, Oakley and Weinstein expressed that they were fond of the episode and did not fully understand the reaction against it. Keeler also defended his work. These were not bad writers. These were people who had contributed significantly to the Golden Age. But that is part of what makes the episode so instructive. It was not made by people who did not care about the show. It was not made by writers who had no talent or no understanding of what The Simpsons was. It was made by talented people who made a decision that turned out to be deeply wrong. And the wrongness of it was not in the execution, but in the premise. The premise was the problem. The idea that you could take a character the audience had known and trusted for 8 years, reveal that everything about him was a lie, and then simply reset things at the end of the episode as if the revelation had not happened, that idea treated. the audience's investment in the show as something that did not matter. It said, in effect, that the years people had spent watching and caring about these characters could be discarded whenever the writers needed a plot. That nothing was permanent. That nothing had to be earned or respected. The golden age of The Simpsons had been built on exactly the opposite principle. The characters were real. Their histories mattered. When Homer did something that affected his family, it meant something, because the family was real in the way cartoon families can be real when writers respect them. When Lisa was lonely, it hurt, because her loneliness had been established carefully and consistently over many seasons. The show had built a world with genuine weight to it. The Principal and the Pauper demonstrated that the writers were now willing to pick that world up, shake it, and put it back down without caring what fell out. The AV Club's Alastair Wilkins was direct about what the episode signaled. He wrote that from this point on, the show was in its decline phase. He acknowledged there was room to argue about how steep the drop was, but the direction was clear. The show had entered a period where individual episodes could still be good. Season 9 had genuinely excellent moments alongside this one, but the overall commitment to the world the Golden Age had built was no longer guaranteed. What makes this episode the right place to mark the beginning of the end is not simply that it was bad. The Simpsons had had bad episodes before. Every long-running show has bad episodes. A single bad episode does not kill a Golden Age. What kills a golden age is when a bad episode reveals a change in how the people making the show think about what they are doing. The Principal and the Pauper did not just produce a bad story. It revealed a willingness to treat continuity, the accumulated history of who these characters were, as optional. As something that could be sacrificed for the sake of a plot idea that seemed interesting in the writer's room, regardless of what it meant for everything the show had built. And once that willingness existed, it could not be undiscovered. The writers now knew they could do this kind of thing. Some of them clearly thought they should be able to do this kind of thing. The judge ordering that no one ever mention Armin Tamzarian again was a joke. But the joke was also a policy. The show was telling itself and its audience that its own history could be sealed away and forgotten when it became inconvenient. That policy would define the post-Golden Age era more than any other single characteristic. Characters would stop being who they had been established to be and would become exaggerated versions of one or two of their most recognizable traits. Stories would stop coming from who the characters genuinely were and would start being constructed around whoever the guest star of the week was. The family would travel to places and do things that had nothing to do with who they actually were because the places were interesting and the stories were easy to construct. The show that had once asked, as Sam Simon insisted it must, "What are they thinking?" was now asking a different question. It was asking, what would be funny if we did not have to worry about what these people would actually do? The answer to that question produced many seasons of television that were sometimes amusing and occasionally even very good. But it never again produced the Golden Age. Because the Golden Age was built on the answer to Sam Simon's question, and once you stop asking that question, you cannot simply decide to start asking it again and expect the same results. The Principal and the Pauper was not the only reason the Golden Age ended. It was a symptom as much as a cause, evidence that something had already shifted in the room, in the thinking, in the priorities of the people making the show. The talent was still there. The resources were still there. The audience was still there. But the philosophy that had built something extraordinary was beginning to crack. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And while all of this was happening on screen, something was happening off screen too. Something in the character of Homer Simpson himself that would become the most visible and the most discussed symptom of everything that was going wrong. Because Homer did not just stay the same while the show around him declined. Homer changed. And the way he changed tells you more about what the Golden Age actually was, and what its death actually meant, than almost anything else in the show's history. Section 7. Homer's Fall. From Everyman to Jerkass. There is a version of Homer Simpson that the world fell in love with. He is not smart. He is not successful. He is not thin or responsible or particularly good at most of the things that adults are supposed to be good at. He forgets anniversaries. He falls asleep at work. He eats food that belongs to other people without a second thought. He has made every bad decision a person can make, usually multiple times, usually in the same week. But in the Golden Age, Homer Simpson was lovable in spite of all of that. Not because the show pretended his flaws did not exist, but because underneath every failure and every mistake and every moment of spectacular stupidity, there was something genuine. A love for his family so complete and so unconditional that it rescued him every time. A willingness, when it truly mattered, to do the right thing even when it cost him everything. He jumped Springfield Gorge on a skateboard to impress his son Bart. He gave up his dream job at a bowling alley to go back to working at the nuclear power plant when Marge became pregnant with Maggie, because the family needed the money and his family came first. He walked into danger, made himself look ridiculous, humiliated himself completely, over and over again, for the people he loved. That Homer, the flawed, failing, fundamentally decent Homer of the Golden Age, was one of the great characters in the history of American television. He does not exist anymore. And the story of how he disappeared is one of the clearest ways to understand what the death of the Golden Age actually felt like from the inside. The term that fans eventually settled on for what Homer became is jerk-ass Homer. The name comes directly from the show itself. In the Season 9 episode, The Joy of Sect, which aired in February 1998, the same season as The Principal and the Pauper, Homer repeatedly uses the word jerkass while yelling at random strangers for no particular reason. The scene is played for laughs, but fans watching the show in those years latched onto the phrase because it described something real. Homer was becoming a jerkass. Not occasionally, not as part of a story where he learned a lesson, but consistently and as a defining characteristic. The shift did not happen overnight. There were signs of it earlier. As far back as Season 6, there were episodes where Homer behaved badly in ways that the show did not fully hold him accountable for. But through the Golden Age, those moments were the exception. When Homer acted selfishly, the story usually found a way to remind him, and the audience, that his selfishness had consequences and that he was capable of better. By Season 9 and Season 10, the exception had become the rule. The specific examples of jerk-ass Homer that fans and critics point to most often come from the seasons Mike Scully ran, Seasons 9 through 12. They are not subtle examples. They are not cases where reasonable people might disagree about whether Homer crossed a line. In Season 10's Homer Simpson in Kidney Trouble, Homer's father Grandpa develops kidney failure after Homer forces him to drink too much water on a road trip. Grandpa needs a kidney transplant. Homer agrees to donate one of his kidneys. Then, on the morning of the surgery, Homer panics, runs away from the hospital, and abandons his father. He goes back eventually, but only after the episode has spent considerable time with Homer being completely comfortable with letting his father die, rather than face the minor discomfort of a medical procedure. In Season 15's Codependence Day, Homer frames Marge for drunk driving. Not in an accidental or ambiguous way. He deliberately sets her up to take the blame for something he did. In Season 9's Trash of the Titans, which actually won an Emmy Award, a fact that makes the episode's content more rather than less interesting, Homer gets into a dispute with the city's garbage collectors and refuses to apologize. His refusal leads to a chain of events that ends with Homer flooding Springfield with garbage and forcing the entire town to physically relocate. These are not the actions of a man who loves his family and sometimes fails them. These are the actions of a man who is primarily concerned with himself and treats the people around him as inconveniences. The Homer of Homer's Barbershop Quartet and Marge versus the Monorail would not recognize himself in these stories. CBR described the shift clearly. The Golden Age Homer was ultimately driven to provide for his family and sacrificed dream jobs for their financial security and repeatedly endangered himself if it meant protecting them. Jerkass Homer was solely driven by personal gain and pride, more belittling of others, less concerned with the safety of his children, and quicker to anger and mockery. That is not a small change. That is a complete reversal of what the character was. The broader pattern that Homer's transformation represents has a name in television criticism. The name came directly from The Simpsons itself. It is called Flanderization. The word comes from Ned Flanders, Homer's neighbor, the man whose seemingly perfect life drove Homer to jealousy and resentment across the Golden Age. In the Golden Age, Ned Flanders was a specific and carefully constructed character. He was genuinely kind. He was naturally more polite, generous, and emotionally stable than Homer, not as a joke, but as a real characteristic. His faith was part of who he was, something that gave his life structure and meaning. But it was not the only thing he was. He was worldly. He had a sense of humor. He was a full person. As the seasons went on, Ned Flanders became less of a full person and more of a single trait wearing a person's clothes. His religion went from being one part of him to being all of him. Every scene he was in became about his faith in ways that stopped being character-driven and started being mechanical. The specific man the Golden Age had built was replaced by a walking religious joke. TV tropes, where the term Flanderization now lives permanently in the cultural dictionary, describes the process as what happens when a character's single most recognizable trait gets exaggerated and amplified over time until it consumes everything else about them. The person disappears. The trait remains. Homer's version of Flanderization was his stupidity and his selfishness. Both existed in the Golden Age. Both were part of who he was. But in the Golden Age, they were balanced by everything else he was. By season 11, the balance was gone. The stupidity had become so extreme that it stopped being endearing and started being exhausting. As TV tropes put it, by season 11, Homer lost whatever impulse control he had left, took a level in dumbass, and became a dangerously imbecilic, aggressive alcoholic with no emotional control, bursting into tears and throwing a temper tantrum on a regular basis. That is not Homer Simpson. That is a cartoon of Homer Simpson. The question of why this happened, why the show allowed its central character to drift so far from what he had been, does not have a single clean answer. But the most commonly discussed factor is the change in who was running the show. Chris Turner wrote in Planet Simpson that somewhere around season 9 or 10, the show's writers began to rely on gags, not characters. That switch from characters to gags, from asking what Homer would do to asking what would be funny, is the cleanest explanation for what happened to him. When you write from the character outward, Homer's love for his family puts a limit on how awful he can be. He can fail. He can embarrass himself. He can make terrible decisions. But he cannot abandon his dying father in a hospital, because that is not who Homer Simpson is. The character's established history acts as a wall. The writers cannot take him past it without breaking something. When you write from the gag outward, when you start with, "Wouldn't it be funny if Homer did this terrible thing?" and work backwards, that wall disappears. Suddenly, anything Homer does can be justified as long as it produces a laugh. The character stops being a person and starts being a delivery device for whatever the episode needs him to deliver. That is what happened to Homer. And it is what happened, to varying degrees, to almost every major character in the show during the post-Golden Age years. Ned Flanders, Chief Wiggum, Mayor Quimby, even Lisa, who began to drift from the specific kind of intellectual loneliness that made her Golden Age stories so moving, into a more simplified version of herself, correct about everything, frustrated by everyone, the show's mouthpiece for messages rather than a real child trying to navigate a world that did not quite fit her. The Simpsons had coined the term Flanderization, and then, with uncomfortable thoroughness, demonstrated exactly what it meant by doing it to almost everyone in its own cast. The version of Homer Simpson that exists today is almost unrecognizable from the man who stood at the edge of Springfield Gorge and decided to jump it for his son. That Homer was brave in the specific way that only truly loving fathers can be brave. Not because they are fearless, but because the love is bigger than the fear. That version of Homer cried at the end of "And Maggie Makes Three" when he looked at the photographs of Maggie he had put up at work to cover the sign that read, "Don't forget, you're here forever." He turned those photos into a message that said, "Do it for her." A man who could not express his love in words had found a way to surround himself with it every single day. That moment, quiet, visual, completely wordless, devastating in the best possible way, could not have been written for jerk-ass Homer. It required a Homer who had genuine depth underneath the comedy. A Homer who is real in the way fictional characters can be real when the people writing them understand that characters are not jokes, they are people. The death of that Homer was not announced. There was no episode where the show said goodbye to the man he had been. He simply drifted, season by season, further from himself. Until one day, fans looked at the screen and realized the person they were watching bore so little resemblance to the character they had loved that the name Homer Simpson had started to feel like the only thing the two versions had in common. Homer's fall is the most human story in the death of the Golden Age. Because it is the story of what happens when the people responsible for a character stop asking who he is and start asking only what he can do for a joke. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And Homer was not the only victim of that shift. The writer's room that had protected these characters, that had understood them deeply enough to know what they would and would not do, was itself changing. The people inside it were changing, and the man who had perhaps done more damage to the show's identity than any single writer in its history was about to become the most talked about showrunner The Simpsons had ever had. Section 8. Mike Scully and the cartoon that replaced the sitcom. There is a specific moment in a long-running television show when you can feel the people making it stop trusting what made it great. It does not always announce itself loudly. It does not always arrive in the form of a single catastrophic decision. Sometimes it arrives gradually, in the way stories start to feel slightly less grounded than they used to, in the way characters start to behave in ways that are technically possible but feel slightly off, in the way the emotional moments that used to land with real weight, start to feel like they are going through the motions of emotion rather than actually producing it. For The Simpsons, that gradual shift has a specific era attached to it, seasons 9 through 12, the years between 1997 and 2001, the years when a man named Mike Scully was the showrunner. It is important to say clearly, before anything else, that Mike Scully is not a villain. He is not an incompetent person who stumbled into a job he was not qualified for. He wrote some genuinely excellent Simpsons episodes before becoming showrunner. Lisa on Ice, Lisa's Rival, Marge Be Not Proud. Episodes that understood the characters and delivered both comedy and emotional truth in the way the Golden Age demanded. The people who worked under him described him as organized, professional, and genuinely kind. Writer Tom Martin called him, quite possibly the best boss I have ever worked for. He won 5 Primetime Emmy Awards during his tenure. He maintained strong ratings. By almost every external measure, his time running the show was a success. And yet, his era is remembered by fans and critics, and even some of the people who worked on the show itself, as the period when something essential was lost. Not immediately, not completely, but permanently. Mike Scully became showrunner of The Simpsons in 1997, taking over at the start of season 9. He had joined the writing staff in 1993 under David Merkin and had spent several seasons learning the show from the inside before taking the top position. He was the first person to run the show for more than 2 consecutive seasons. He held the showrunner role through season 12, 4 seasons in total, before handing the position to Al Jean in 2001. His stated goal when he took the job was simple. He told the press that his aim was not to wreck the show. That phrase, not to wreck the show, reveals something important about the anxiety that came with the position. By 1997, The Simpsons was not just a television program. It was a cultural institution. It was the greatest show on television, and everyone who worked on it knew that was what it was. The pressure of maintaining that standard, Scully acknowledged, was enormous. But there is a difference between trying not to wreck something and trying to make it great. The golden age had been made by people who were trying to make something great. They were trying to write episodes that would make their colleagues, some of the funniest people in television, laugh out loud in the rewriting sessions. They were trying to write moments that would genuinely move the audience. They were trying to produce something that nobody had ever seen before. Not to wreck the show is a much lower bar. And sometimes, when you are aiming for a lower bar, you hit it. The most detailed and cutting description of what changed under Scully came from Chris Sullentrop of Slate, who wrote that under Scully's time as showrunner, The Simpsons became, well, a cartoon. He elaborated that episodes which once would have ended with Homer and Marge cycling into the sunset, warm, grounded, emotionally resolved, were now ending with Homer blowing a tranquilizer dart into Marge's neck. That contrast, cycling into the sunset versus tranquilizer dart, is not just about one episode being darker than another. It is about a fundamental shift in what kind of show The Simpsons had decided it was. The Golden Age ending had been a sitcom about a real family who happened to be animated. The humor came from recognizable human situations pushed to their most absurd logical conclusions. The emotion came from the family actually caring about each other. The satire worked because it was rooted in a world that felt real enough to be worth satirizing. What Scully's era gradually produced, in the view of its critics, was something different. A cartoon in the more traditional sense, a show where anything could happen to anyone because the rules of reality and character consistency were secondary to whether a particular gag was funny in the moment. A show where Homer could do something completely out of character because the plot required it, and the writers had stopped asking whether Homer would actually do that. A show where emotional moments arrived not because the story had earned them, but because the episode was running out of time and needed to wrap up. George Meyer, one of the most respected voices in the show's history, the man A.O. Scott called the guru of the writer's room, gave an interview to MSNBC during this period that captured what was happening from the inside. He said, "We have more writers now. In the early days, more of the show, more of the episode, was already in the first draft of the script. Now there is more room writing that goes on, and so I think there has been a kind of homogenization of the scripts." Homogenization. That word is careful and precise. Meyer was not saying the scripts were bad. He was saying they were becoming the same. That the process of multiple writers reshaping every script in the rewriting sessions was producing something smooth and consistent, but also flatter, drained of the specific individual voice that made the best Golden Age scripts feel like they could only have been written by one particular person with one particular perspective. John Swartzwelder's scripts had a voice. George Meyer's contributions to a rewrite had a voice. Conan O'Brien's scripts had a voice. The Golden Age was built on specific voices. When the room got bigger and the process of collective rewriting became more dominant, those specific voices got averaged out. Mike Reiss, one of the original showrunners who had been part of the show since season 1, gave an interview to the New York Times Magazine during this period that is perhaps the most painful statement any Golden Age writer made about what was happening to their show. He said, "Much of the humanity has leached out of the show over the years. It hurts to watch it, even if I helped do it. It hurts to watch it, even if I helped do it." That sentence carries a weight that is difficult to overstate. This is not a critic who never liked the show. This is not a fan who felt let down from the outside. This is one of the people who built the Golden Age, sitting down to watch what his show had become and feeling hurt by it. The show he had helped make extraordinary had drifted far enough from what it was that one of its own architects could no longer watch it without pain. DVD Verdicts reviewer noted while covering Season 10 that while the episodes still contained plenty of laughs, the season was missing the emotional core of the earlier seasons. That phrase, emotional core, is the key. The comedy was still functional. The show was still producing jokes, still delivering funny moments, still capable of making people laugh. But the thing underneath the comedy, the thing that made the comedy matter, was weakening. And Scully himself was aware of the criticism. In interviews during his tenure, he made comments that showed a man caught between the pressure of maintaining a legendary show and the awareness that the show was changing in ways he could not fully control. He knew what people were saying. He knew what the fans on the internet were writing. The show had been running long enough that a passionate and vocal fan community had developed, and that community was not silent about what it saw happening. One specific pattern that emerged during the Scully era, and that critics pointed to repeatedly as evidence of the shift from character-driven stories to gag-driven ones, was the Homer Gets a New Job episode. The Golden Age had Homer getting new jobs too. Homer at the bat came from Homer's love of baseball. Homer the Smithers came from a story about the relationship between Mr. Burns and Waylon Smithers. You Only Move Twice gave Homer a dream job that turned out to be working for a supervillain. In each case, the new job served the story. It came from who Homer was and what the show wanted to say. By season 10, Michael Passman of the Michigan Daily wrote that Homer's get-rich-quick schemes start to become all too prevalent, and the pattern had become mechanical. In season 10 alone, Homer worked as a truck driver, a celebrity assistant, an inventor, a hippie, a bodyguard, a spring salesman, and a pop artist. As Paste magazine noted, it was all just too much. Homer was no longer finding new jobs because the story required it. He was finding new jobs because the writers needed a plot, and that was the easiest plot to reach for. This is what happens when you are writing from the gag outward rather than from the character outward. You find the patterns that produce content reliably, and you return to them. Homer gets a job. Homer meets a celebrity. Homer and the family travel somewhere unusual. These structures work well enough to fill 22 minutes. They produce laughs often enough to satisfy a weekly broadcast schedule. But they do not produce the Golden Age, because the Golden Age was not built on reliable patterns. It was built on specific, original stories that came from a genuine understanding of specific, real characters. It would be deeply unfair to suggest that nothing good came out of the Scully era. Treehouse of Horror 8 aired during season 9 and is well regarded. The City of New York vs. Homer Simpson, the season 9 premiere, is one of the best travel episodes the show ever made. Mayored to the Mob in season 10 is frequently cited as one of the last great Homer episodes. Behind the Laughter in season 11, which Scully co-wrote, is considered by current showrunner Al Jean as strong enough that he would accept it as a series finale if the show ever ended. These episodes exist. They are real, and they are good. The Scully era was not a wasteland. But a show is not measured only by its best episodes. It is measured by what it does consistently, by the average quality of what it produces week after week. And the consistent average of seasons 9 through 12 was lower than the consistent average of seasons 3 through 8. Not by a small amount, by a measurable and significant amount, visible in IMDb ratings, in critical assessments, and in the testimony of the people who made the show themselves. John Ortved, who wrote a thorough and detailed history of The Simpsons, describes Scully's position with a sentence that is both generous and devastating. Scully's episodes excel when compared to what The Simpsons airs nowadays, but he was the man, at the helm when the ship turned towards the iceberg. The man at the helm when the ship turned towards the iceberg. Scully did not create the iceberg. The iceberg was the natural consequence of what happens to any show that runs long enough, that loses enough of its original talent, that faces enough pressure to produce content on a weekly schedule without the specific group of people who made its golden age possible. The iceberg was always going to be there. But during his 4 seasons as showrunner, the ship turned. And once a ship turns toward an iceberg, turning it back is much harder than turning it away would have been. Scully left the showrunner role after season 12. Al Jean, one of the original writers, one of the men who had been there since season 1, came back to run the show. He has been running it ever since. The ship did not hit the iceberg at full speed, but it did not fully turn back either. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And while the writing room was changing and the characters were drifting, and the showrunner was doing his best not to wreck a ship that was already pointing in the wrong direction, something else was happening. Something that had nothing to do with creative decisions, or writing philosophy, or the pressures of weekly production. The show was filling its episodes with famous faces, more and more of them, for less and less of a reason. Section 9. The Celebrity Cameo Problem. There is a scene in Season 2 of The Simpsons that almost nobody talks about when they discuss the show's greatest moments. Homer is committed to a mental health facility after wearing a pink shirt to work, which his boss, Mr. Burns, interprets as a sign of emotional instability. At the facility, Homer meets a large white man named Leon Kompowski, who claims to be Michael Jackson. The man cannot prove it. He does not look like Michael Jackson. He speaks in a deep, flat voice that sounds nothing like Michael Jackson. But he is kind and patient and genuinely interested in Homer's life, in a way that most people in Homer's life are not. Homer decides he does not care whether the man is really Michael Jackson or not. He likes him. They become friends. The episode is called Stark Raving Dad, and it is one of the most beloved episodes of the show's entire run. Michael Jackson himself voiced the character, but he was credited under a fake name, John J. Smith, because he wanted to participate without the full weight of his celebrity attached to it. His name does not appear in the credits as Michael Jackson. The episode does not stop every few minutes to remind you that Michael Jackson is in it. It uses his voice to tell a story about Homer finding an unexpected friend and Bart learning to appreciate his sister Lisa. And it does all of this so gently and so warmly that many people who watched it as children remember it as one of the first times a cartoon made them feel genuinely moved. That is how the Golden Age used celebrity guests. The celebrity served the story. The story did not exist to serve the celebrity. Understanding that difference is the key to understanding one of the most discussed symptoms of the Golden Age's decline. The Simpsons did not invent the celebrity guest star. Television had been putting famous faces into popular shows for decades before Springfield existed. But what the Golden Age did with celebrity appearances was genuinely different from what most shows did, and the difference was not subtle. In the Golden Age, the most celebrated guest appearances were ones where the celebrity either did not play themselves at all, or where they played themselves in a way that was completely in service of the episode's story rather than in service of the celebrity's image. Dustin Hoffman voiced Mr. Bergstrom in Lisa's Substitute, the gentle, perceptive substitute teacher who sees Lisa for exactly who she is. He was credited as Sam Eddick. His name was not used. The episode did not wave a flag saying, "Look, Dustin Hoffman is here." It simply used his voice to create a character so warm and so real that the scene where he leaves Lisa his note, "You are Lisa Simpson," became one of the most quietly devastating moments in the show's history. Albert Brooks voiced Hank Scorpio in You Only Move Twice, the cheerful, supportive boss who also happens to be building a doomsday weapon. Brooks was credited as A. Brooks, a shortened version of his name that was also technically a different name. The episode used his specific gift for playing charming, fast-talking characters to create someone so genuinely likable that the audience, like Homer, found themselves almost wishing they could work for a supervillain if he was this encouraging about it. Phil Hartman voiced Lyle Landley in Marge vs. the Monorail, the con man selling a worthless monorail to a town that should know better. The character was built on Hartman's specific talent for smooth, practiced, utterly shameless charm. The episode needed someone who could make the audience fall for Landley even while knowing he was a fraud, and Hartman delivered that with complete precision. In all of these cases, the guest star was a tool, a very good tool, used very skillfully in service of a story that would have needed to exist regardless of who was voicing the character. The celebrities did not create the episodes. The episodes found the right celebrities to help them become what they needed to be. The shift away from this model did not happen all at once. It crept in gradually, the way most of the Golden Age's decline crept in. Slowly enough that it was hard to point to the exact moment it started, but clearly enough in hindsight that the pattern is unmistakable. Season 10 is where most critics and fans identify the first significant break, specifically an episode called When You Dish Upon a Star. In this episode, Homer accidentally crashes through the skylight of a holiday home belonging to actors Alec Baldwin and Kim Basinger, who are vacationing in Springfield with director Ron Howard. Homer befriends them. He betrays their trust by stealing their personal belongings and using them to start a celebrity memorabilia business. They respond by taking out a restraining order against him. The celebrities in this episode play themselves. They are there because they are famous, and the episode is built around the fact that they are famous. There is no Hank Scorpio here, no character built from scratch with a specific role in a specific story. There is just Alec Baldwin and Kim Basinger being Alec Baldwin and Kim Basinger in Springfield, because the writers thought it would be interesting to put Alec Baldwin and Kim Basinger in Springfield. Chris Barsanti of FilmCritic.com identified Season 10 as the point when the show developed the bad habit of building episodes around celebrity guests, who were practically never as amusing as they were meant to be. That phrase, building episodes around celebrity guests, captures the reversal precisely. The Golden Age built stories and then found celebrities to serve them. The post-Golden Age built episodes around celebrities and then constructed stories to justify their presence. A statistical analysis of celebrity appearances on the show found something striking. The first season to cross the threshold of one celebrity guest per episode, on average, was Season 10. The same season that data analysts identified as the mathematical end of the Golden Age. The correlation is not a coincidence. The two things were symptoms of the same underlying shift. The show was increasingly reaching for external material, famous names, famous faces, famous personalities, to fill the space that original storytelling had once occupied. Entertainment Weekly captured the pattern in a critique that became widely quoted. They said the show had fallen back on the formula of a celebrity guest star voices a character who is only funny because they are voiced by a celebrity. That sentence describes something specific and real. There is a kind of comedy that exists purely because of the gap between who someone is in real life and what they are being asked to do on screen. A very serious actor playing something silly. A very famous musician appearing in a cartoon. The joke is not in the writing. The joke is in the casting. And that kind of joke has a very short shelf life, because once the audience has registered the surprise of seeing this famous person in this context, there is nothing left to sustain their interest. The Golden Age had understood this. When Dustin Hoffman voiced Mr. Bergstrom, the joke was not that Dustin Hoffman was doing a cartoon voice. There was no joke at all in the casting. The casting was simply right for the character, and the character was right for the story, and the story was worth telling. When the post-Golden Age put celebrities in episodes primarily because of who they were rather than because of what the story needed, the laughs became shallower and the stories became less meaningful. The celebrity's presence filled the screen without filling the episode. The worst example, the case that stands as the clearest possible illustration of how far the approach had fallen from the Golden Age standard, is Season 23's Lisa Goes Gaga. The episode features Lady Gaga traveling to Springfield on a train after hearing that the town is deeply unhappy. She decides to cheer everyone up. She focuses particular attention on Lisa, who is going through a period of being unpopular at school. The episode resolves with music and affirmation. The episode has a rating of 4.3 out of 10 on IMDb. That is not just the lowest rated episode of The Simpsons, it is significantly lower than the second lowest rated episode, lower by a margin that suggests something more than ordinary disappointment. The audience did not just find it weak, they found it genuinely bad in a way that felt like a betrayal of what the show was supposed to be. The comparison to Stark Raving Dad is instructive and painful. Both episodes feature a global music superstar interacting with a member of the Simpson family during a period of emotional difficulty. Both episodes are built around the idea that this famous person can offer something the family member needs. But Stark Raving Dad did all of this without ever making Michael Jackson's fame the point. The episode was about Homer finding friendship and Bart finding appreciation for his sister. The celebrity was the vehicle, the emotion was the destination. Lisa Goes Gaga reversed this completely. Lady Gaga's fame was not the vehicle, it was the destination. The episode existed primarily as a showcase for the celebrity. The story was constructed to put Lady Gaga in as many scenes as possible, to feature her music as prominently as possible, and to treat her presence as the main event rather than as a tool for telling a story about the characters the audience actually cared about. The researcher Nathan Kuhn, who conducted a detailed statistical analysis of Simpsons celebrity appearances, put it this way: the problem with the worst celebrity cameos was not that celebrities were present, but that the episode feels more like it, exists solely as a vehicle to get the celebrity on the show. In the Golden Age, he noted, guest stars seemed to be of secondary importance to the plot. In the worst post-Golden Age examples, the guest star was the plot. And a guest star is not a plot. A guest star is a person who can help a plot, if the plot is good enough to need their specific help. It is worth being precise about what this pattern tells us about the broader decline. The celebrity cameo problem was not the cause of the Golden Age's death. It was a symptom. It appeared because the writer's room had lost the specific concentration of original talent that once generated stories powerful enough to stand entirely on their own. When you have John Swartzwelder and George Meyer and Conan O'Brien in the same room, you do not need to build an episode around Alec Baldwin. You have enough original ideas to fill every episode several times over, and celebrities serve those ideas rather than replacing them. When that talent dispersed, when Swartzwelder retreated to his home booth and eventually left, when Meyer's active role in the room diminished, when the writers who had defined the Golden Age moved on to other projects, the room needed to find other ways to fill the space. Celebrity names became one of those ways. Familiar formats became another. Homer getting a new job. The family traveling somewhere new. The show finding increasingly elaborate ways to put famous people in Springfield and hoping that the resulting episodes would be interesting enough. They were, sometimes, not always. And the gap between sometimes and always is the distance between the Golden Age and everything that came after it. The show that had once made Michael Jackson's voice a secret so that the story could speak for itself was now building entire episodes around the fact that a celebrity had agreed to appear. The priority had inverted, and once a priority inverts in a creative work, it takes something extraordinary to invert it back. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The celebrity problem was visible to anyone watching closely enough. But there was another kind of problem, one that was just as visible and even more depressing to the fans who remembered what the show had been. It lived not in the guest stars, but in the data, in the numbers, in the cold, measurable record of what was happening to the show's quality season by season, tracked in ratings and reviews, and the slow, quiet way the audience began to understand that the golden age was not just declining, it was over. Section 10. The Last Gasp. Season 8 as both peak and prologue. There is something bittersweet about Season 8 of The Simpsons. When you watch it knowing what comes after, knowing what the show was about to become, knowing which writers were about to leave, knowing which characters were about to drift away from themselves, Season 8 feels like two completely different things at the same time. It feels like the show at the absolute top of its game. Confident, brilliant, funny in ways that make you stop and rewind because you cannot believe a joke that good just happened in a cartoon. Emotionally honest in ways that still catch you off guard even after you have seen the episodes a dozen times. Creative in ways that suggest a room full of people who have not yet run out of original ideas and are not yet reaching for easy ones. But it also feels, if you watch closely enough, like a season that is quietly beginning to say goodbye. Like a summer that is still warm, but where you can feel something in the air that tells you it will not last much longer. Season 8 is the peak and the beginning of the end simultaneously, the highest point of the mountain and the first step of the long walk down. The showrunners for Season 8 were Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein. These two men had been writing for The Simpsons since Season 3, hired when they were in their late 20s. Their two-season run as showrunners across Seasons 7 and 8 produced what the majority of fans and critics consider the single greatest consecutive stretch of episodes in the show's entire history. John Swartzwelder, the most prolific writer the show ever had, the man who wrote 59 episodes and shaped Homer Simpson's comedic identity more than any other single writer, has pointed to Season 3 as the show's best individual season. But the general agreement across critical writing, fan communities, and the people who worked on the show is that Seasons 7 and 8 together represent the golden age fully realized. Every element that had been building since Season 3 was now operating at its highest possible level at the same time. The episodes Season 8 produced are remarkable by any standard. You Only Move Twice is the episode where Homer takes a dream job in a perfectly designed new town called Cypress Creek, completely unaware that his warm and encouraging new boss Hank Scorpio, voiced by Albert Brooks, is also building a doomsday weapon and holding the world hostage. The episode works because of the specific gap between what Homer experiences and what is actually happening around him. Homer is happier and more productive than he has ever been. He is being supported and respected at work for the first time in his life. And the whole thing is happening inside a James Bond villain's secret operation. When the family has to leave at the end of the episode, Scorpio sends Homer a parting gift. Homer had mentioned wanting the Dallas Cowboys football team. Scorpio gives him the Denver Broncos instead. Homer receives an entire professional sports team and immediately starts complaining that it is the wrong one. The comedy is perfect, and the sadness underneath it, Homer finally finding the right place at exactly the wrong time, is completely real. The Mysterious Voyage of Homer sent Homer into a hallucination after he ate a pepper so powerful it existed beyond normal human experience. The episode features some of the most visually ambitious animation the Golden Age ever produced, dreamlike sequences where Homer encounters a coyote spirit guide voiced by Johnny Cash and watches the sun break apart. Cash's voice, warm and unhurried, gives the sequence a gravity that transforms what could have been a simple comedy bit into something genuinely strange and moving. Homer's vision quest leads him back to Marge, back to the understanding that she is the center of his life. And the episode ends with that emotional truth intact in a way that feels earned rather than convenient. Homer versus the 18th Amendment produced the line that may be the single most quoted joke in the show's history. Homer raises a toast and calls alcohol the cause of and solution to all of life's problems. That sentence has been quoted millions of times since it aired. It is the kind of line that stops being just a joke and becomes a genuine observation. Something true about human nature compressed into a single sentence by a writer who understood both comedy and people well enough to make them say the same thing simultaneously. Brother from Another series brought Kelsey Grammer back as Sideshow Bob, alongside David Hyde Pierce as Bob's brother Cecil. Pierce played Niles Crane on Frasier, the show where Grammer played Frasier Crane, meaning the two actors were playing brothers on The Simpsons, having already spent years playing brothers on another show. The casting is so perfectly constructed that it feels less like a clever idea and more like the only possible idea, the one that was always waiting to be used. But Season 8 is also where, if you pay close attention, you can see the shape of what is coming. The show was becoming more aware of itself, more willing to look directly at the camera and wink, more interested in being clever about what it was than in simply being what it was. The Itchy and Scratchy and Poochie show is the clearest example of this. The episode parodies the television industry's habit of adding new characters to struggling shows to boost interest, a practice so common and so transparent that it had already become its own kind of joke before The Simpsons made an entire episode about it. The fictional show within the show adds a character named Poochie, a dog designed by committee to appeal to as many people as possible and therefore appealing to no one. The episode is extremely funny and very sharp about how creative decisions get made when money and ratings are involved. But watching it now, knowing what happened to The Simpsons in the seasons after it, the episode has a layer of sadness that it did not have when it first aired. The show was making fun of exactly the kind of creative decay it was about to experience. It was laughing at the idea of desperate moves made to sustain something past its natural life, completely unaware that it would spend the next 20+ years making those same moves. Homer's enemy carries a similar double meaning. The episode introduces Frank Grimes, a hard-working and deeply serious man who cannot understand why Homer, lazy, irresponsible, perpetually oblivious, is loved and respected by everyone around him. Grimes declares himself Homer's enemy and is eventually driven to a complete breakdown and death by his inability to accept a world where Homer faces no real consequences for being who he is. The episode holds Homer fully accountable in a way the show had always done during the Golden Age. His flaws are not softened or excused. Frank Grimes is right. Homer is, in the specific way Grimes describes, what is wrong with America. Many critics have noted that this episode was also, without intending to be, a farewell to that kind of accountability. After Season 8, Homer would increasingly be written without the emotional consequences that the Golden Age had always attached to his behavior. The lesson that some writers took from Homer's enemy was not that Homer needed to face consequences. It was that Homer could do anything and still be loved. That reading of the episode, wrong but understandable, became the foundation of Jerk-Ass Homer. Phil Hartman was still present in Season 8. Troy McClure appeared in A Fish Called Selma, his most celebrated and most fully realized episode, the one Entertainment Weekly placed 8th on their all-time best Simpsons list. Hartman had one more season after this. Then he would be gone, and his characters would be gone with him. The writing room that had produced everything described in this section was still largely intact, but beginning to thin at the edges. The concentration of original talent that had defined the Golden Age, assembled by Sam Simon, maintained by Gene and Reese, pushed to its peak by Oakley and Weinstein, was about to start breaking apart. Season 9 was coming. Mike Scully was taking over. The Principal and the Pauper was waiting to air. Season 8 did not know it was the last fully healthy season. The people making it were not aware they were producing something that fans would one day look back on as a farewell. They were just making the best show they could make, the same way they had been making the best show they could make for years. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the data that would eventually be gathered across the full run of the series would confirm what watching the show in real time could only suspect. The peak had been reached. Everything that came immediately after it would be slightly less, and everything that came after that would be slightly less again. The numbers that tell that story in precise and measurable detail are what we need to look at next. Section 11. The numbers don't lie. People argue about The Simpsons all the time. They argue about which season is the best. They argue about which episode is the funniest. They argue about exactly when the show stopped being great and started being something else. They argue about whether the decline was sudden or gradual, whether it was caused by one specific moment or by a slow accumulation of smaller losses over time. These arguments are real, and they matter. But underneath all of them, there is a layer of information that does not argue back. A layer that simply tells you what happened in plain numbers, without opinion, without nostalgia, without any attachment to the outcome. The data on The Simpsons is unusually clear, and what it shows is not subtle. The ratings on IMDb for The Simpsons tell a story that moves in one direction. The Golden Age seasons, seasons 3 through 8, the ones running from 1991 to 1997, average approximately 8.2 out of 10 across their combined episodes. That number is not just high for a long-running animated show. It is high by any standard. An 8.2 average across more than 130 episodes means that the show was producing great television consistently, not just occasionally. It means the quality was not something that happened by accident in a handful of standout moments. It was the expected standard, the default setting. Season 3 averages 8.1. Season 4 averages 8.2. Season 5 averages 8.3. The single highest rated full season in the show's history. Season 6 averages 8.1. Season 7 averages 8.2. Season 8 averages 8.1. These numbers are remarkably stable. The Golden Age did not have one great year surrounded by weaker ones. It had 6 consecutive years of television operating at essentially the same extraordinary level. Then Season 9 arrives. Season 9 averages 7.4. That drop from 8.1 to 7.4 in a single season is not the kind of variation you expect from a healthy show finding its way through a slightly rougher patch. It is a structural shift. The floor moved, and it moved in one direction. Analyst Nathan Kunn conducted a detailed study of Simpsons episode ratings and pinpointed the moment when the Golden Age mathematically ended. His conclusion was specific. Season 10, Episode 11, Wild Bart's Can't Be Broken, which aired in January 1999, was the last episode to receive a rating consistent with the Golden Age standard. The episode immediately following it, Season 10, Episode 12, Sunday, Cruddy Sunday, dropped to 6.9. That is not a small number in isolation. A 6.9 on IMDb for most television shows would represent a perfectly acceptable episode. But for The Simpsons, a show that had spent 6 full seasons producing episodes averaging above 8.0, a 6.9 represents something specific. It represents the moment when the show stopped being what it had been and became something measurably different. By season 20, episodes were consistently landing around 7.0. The distance between 8.2 and 7.0 is the distance between great and acceptable, between a show that people remember for the rest of their lives and a show that people watch and then forget. Viewership numbers tell an equally clear story. During the Golden Age, The Simpsons regularly drew between 20 and 30 million viewers per episode in the United States. These were not just strong numbers for an animated show. They were competitive with the most watched programming on all of television. The show was a genuine national event. People arranged their schedules around it. Missing an episode meant missing something that would be talked about the next day. Recent seasons have drawn fewer than 2 million viewers per episode on Fox. That is a decline of more than 90%. Some of that decline reflects changes in how people watch television. Streaming, DVR, online viewing, all of these have pulled viewers away from traditional live broadcast numbers across every show on every network. The general audience for network television has been shrinking for decades, and The Simpsons is not alone in experiencing that. But even accounting for all of those changes, the decline for The Simpsons is steeper than the general decline in network television viewership over the same period. The show lost its audience faster than the industry lost its audience, which means the numbers are telling you something about the show itself, not just about the world it exists in. The history of the DVD releases adds another dimension to this picture. Fox began releasing The Simpsons on DVD in 2001. The first release, Season 1, became the best-selling television DVD in history at the time of its release. People wanted these episodes in a permanent, physical form they could keep and return to. The demand was immediate and enormous. Fox continued releasing seasons steadily through the following years. Seasons 1 through 8, the complete Golden Age, were available on DVD. Then seasons 9 through 17 followed, released between 2006 and 2014. In April 2015, Al Jean, who has been the showrunner since season 13 and continues to run the show today, announced that season 17 would be the last season ever released on DVD. Seasons 18, 19, 20, 21, and everything after them would never receive a physical release. The reason given was that the market for the DVDs had shrunk too significantly to justify the cost of production. But the pattern is worth noting. Every Golden Age season was released and sold in enormous numbers. The seasons that followed were released with decreasing enthusiasm and decreasing sales. And then the releases stopped entirely at a point that corresponds almost exactly with where most fans and critics agree the quality had long since ceased to justify the nostalgia that drove the original purchases. People bought the Golden Age on DVD because they wanted to own it. They were less interested in owning what came after. There is one more element in the numbers that deserves attention. The IMDb ratings for later seasons are, in a specific way, more favorable to those seasons than they should be. The reason is survivorship bias, a straightforward idea that simply means the people still rating episodes of The Simpsons in Season 20, or Season 25, or Season 30 are not a representative sample of the full audience. They are the most dedicated, most loyal, most forgiving portion of the fan base. The casual viewers who are watching during the Golden Age and drifted away as quality declined are no longer participating in the ratings. This means the 7.0 average for later seasons is being generated by the people most inclined to rate those seasons generously. If the full original audience were still participating, the numbers would almost certainly be lower. The actual quality gap between the Golden Age and everything that followed is likely larger than the ratings difference suggests. The BBC wrote in 2010 that the common understanding among viewers was that the Golden Age ended after season 9. CNN's Todd Leopold noted that for many fans, the glory days were long past. Entertainment Weekly, which had given the show an A grade in 1990 and an A+ in 1997, revised its assessment to a B- by 2012. The show won 34 Primetime Emmy Awards across its run. Time magazine named it the greatest television series of the 20th century in 1999. These honors are real and they are significant, but it is worth noting that the Time magazine recognition came in 1999, at the very end of what most people now consider the Golden Age, and before the full shape of the decline was visible. The honors were given to the version of the show that the numbers confirm was the genuinely great version. Numbers do not have feelings about what they are measuring. They do not care that the show they are describing was once something that changed television permanently and shaped the way an entire generation understood comedy and family and what animated storytelling could do. They just tell you what happened. And what happened is documented clearly across more than 3 decades of data. The Golden Age was real, it was measurable, it produced television that still rates among the greatest ever made, and it ended. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What it left behind when it ended, the influence, the language, the permanent mark it made on everything that came after it, is the final part of this story, and it is the part we need to look at now. Section 12. The legacy that outlives the decline. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. The Simpsons has been on the air for more than 35 years. It has produced more than 750 episodes. It has won 34 Primetime Emmy Awards. It has been watched by billions of people across dozens of countries. It has generated more money than most countries produce in a year. It is, by almost every measurable standard, one of the most successful pieces of entertainment ever created by human beings. And yet, the conversation most people want to have about it is about the years when it was at its best. The 6 seasons. The 130 episodes. The specific window between 1991 and 1997, when a group of unusually talented people were all in the same room at the same time, making something that none of them fully understood, was as rare as it was. That tells you something important, not just about The Simpsons specifically, but about what greatness actually is and how it works. The legacy of The Simpsons is not built on its size. It is not built on how long it has lasted or how many episodes it has produced. It is built on those 6 seasons. Everything else, the longevity, the merchandise, the cultural presence, exists in the shadow of something that ended in 1997. The most direct measure of the Golden Age's legacy is what it created around itself. Before The Simpsons, primetime animated television for adults essentially did not exist as a serious category. There had been attempts. The Flintstones had run in primetime in the 1960s. But the idea that an animated show could be a genuine cultural event, something sophisticated adults watched and talked about and took seriously, was not an established reality when The Simpsons premiered in December 1989. The Golden Age proved it was possible, and once it proved that, everything changed. Beavis and Butt-Head arrived in 1993. King of the Hill premiered in 1997, created by Mike Judge, running for 13 seasons on Fox. South Park launched in 1997 on Comedy Central, created by Trey Parker and Matt Stone, who have both spoken about The Simpsons as a foundational influence on what they were trying to build. Futurama premiered in 1999, created by Matt Groening himself, directly carrying the creative DNA of the Golden Age into a new setting. Family Guy launched in 1999, created by Seth MacFarlane, who has described The Simpsons as the single most important influence on his approach to animated comedy. Bob's Burgers, Archer, American Dad, BoJack Horseman, Big Mouth. Every adult animated show that came after The Simpsons exists in a space that the Golden Age opened up and made legitimate. The creators of these shows grew up watching seasons 3 through 8. The comedy rhythms they learned, the understanding they developed of what animation could do that live action could not, the belief that animated characters could carry genuine emotion alongside big jokes, all of that came from the Golden Age. The Simpsons did not just influence these shows, it made them possible. The Golden Age also left its mark on the English language in ways that are still visible today. The word Flanderization, the process by which a well-rounded character is slowly reduced to a single defining trait repeated endlessly, entered common usage because of what happened to Ned Flanders on The Simpsons. The term is now used by writers, critics, and fans to describe character decline in any show, any movie, any book. It appears in academic writing. It appears in mainstream journalism. It has its own entries across reference sites. A process that existed in storytelling long before The Simpsons now has a name because of what the show did to one of its own characters. That is a specific and unusual kind of cultural impact. The show did not just produce content that people enjoyed. It produced language that people used to think and talk about content in general. The Golden Age episodes are also among the most quoted and referenced pieces of television ever produced. Lines from these seasons circulate constantly across the internet, appearing in conversations that have nothing to do with The Simpsons. Stupid, sexy Flanders. No, I said ARG! I was going to say Argentina. You tried your best and you failed miserably. The lesson is, never try. Can't sleep, clown will eat me. These lines have detached from the episodes that produce them and become part of general cultural vocabulary. People use them who have never watched the original episodes. They exist independently now, which is what happens to the best lines from the greatest works. The Golden Age produced this kind of language in extraordinary volume. Later seasons have produced almost none of it. Mike Reiss, one of the original showrunners who ran the show during seasons 3 and 4, gave an interview to the New York Times Magazine in which he said that much of the humanity had left the show and that it hurts to watch it, even knowing that he helped create it. That quote has been repeated many times because it captures something precise about the specific kind of loss that the decline of The Simpsons represents. It is not just that the show got worse. Lots of shows get worse. What makes The Simpsons decline different is that the people who built the Golden Age have had to watch something they created continue under different conditions and become something they no longer recognize. Rice was not speaking as a disappointed viewer. He was speaking as someone who knew what the show was built to be and could see the distance between that and what it had become. Al Jean, who has been the showrunner since season 13 and who is also one of the original Golden Age showrunners, has continued running the show longer than anyone else in its history. The show passed 750 episodes during his tenure. He has defended the later seasons and expressed genuine pride in the show's longevity. These two things, Reese's honest grief and Gene's genuine commitment, can both be true simultaneously. The show has lasted, and something essential about what made it worth lasting has been gone for a long time. In February 2024, The Simpsons aired its 751st episode. Fox renewed the show through season 38. The show continues to produce new episodes every year, seen by a fraction of the audience that watched the Golden Age, but still present, still running, still technically the same show that premiered in December 1989. There is something genuinely strange about this. No other show in television history has maintained this kind of presence for this long while also being so clearly defined by a specific early period. When people talk about Seinfeld, they talk about the whole run. When people talk about Breaking Bad, they talk about the whole run. When people talk about The Simpsons, they almost always mean the Golden Age, even if they do not say so explicitly. The show has become two things sharing one name. There is the Golden Age Simpsons, the one that Time magazine called the greatest television series of the 20th century, the one that changed what animation was allowed to be, the one that produced Hank Scorpio and Phil Hartman and Frank Grimes, and the monorail and steamed hams and the Guatemalan insanity pepper. And there is the post-Golden Age Simpsons, the one that has lasted 3 times as long, produced 5 times as many episodes, and generated a fraction of the cultural impact. Both of these things are real. Both of them are The Simpsons. But only one of them is what people mean when they say the show was great. The Golden Age ended because the specific conditions that created it could not last. Sam Simon left. The original writers dispersed. Phil Hartman was murdered. The show got too big and too institutional for the kind of tight creative control that had made the early seasons possible. New writers came in who had grown up watching the show rather than building it from nothing. And something in that transition changed the fundamental nature of what was being made. These things were probably inevitable to some degree. The concentration of talent in any one place at any one time is always temporary. What is not inevitable, what was specific and rare and genuinely unlikely, was that the concentration happened at all. That Sam Simon and Matt Groening and James L. Brooks found each other. That George Meyer and John Swartzwelder and Conan O'Brien and Al Jean and all the others ended up in the same writer's room at the same time. That Phil Hartman was available and willing and brought exactly what those two characters needed. That all of these things aligned for 6 consecutive seasons and produced something the world had never seen before and has not seen again since. The legacy of The Simpsons' Golden Age is not complicated. It changed television permanently. It created a language people still speak. It produced episodes that people still watch 30 years later and still find funny and still find moving and still find true. It was, while it lasted, the best show on television by a distance that no other animated series has ever closed. And now that we understand exactly what it was, exactly how it was built, exactly why it ended, and exactly what it left behind, there is one final question worth asking. Not about the show, about us. About why we keep coming back to it. About what we are actually looking for when we return to Springfield one more time. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.